Nice calm atmosphere. Welcome the multitudes of Lisbon flooding in all at once. I hope you can all find a comfortable place to sit and enjoy the various streams of sewerage to spill from my wonderfully sculpted lips. My name is Pascal, so welcome everyone. I'm seeing mostly people I actually know, which is always a shame, I guess. There's nothing new to life, nothing new under the sun. But welcome to any new people I don't recognise. And you're my prisoner, I guess, for however long it gets to take me to finish this first of 4 lectures, boys and girls. This is a lecture called Towards Gutter Mysticism. Gutter Mysticism and Subreal. Gutter Mysticism and Subreal. First of all, what is gutter? Gutter for Portuguese. Esgotos, right? Surjeta, okay. O esgoto. So the pipes, the sewage. We'll get talking about piss and shit and vomit later on and in the forthcoming lectures. But any sort of masturbating quasi-academic will first of all introduce the subject, introduce things, preface, gently edge into the topic before actually launching in. So it might be a little bit of a frustrating first lecture, but I need to do a little bit of background before we truly begin. So welcome one and all. Please make yourselves comfortable. There should be seats available, and there will be opportunity for crowd surfing at some point as well. There are more seats in there, I think. Anyway, hello, welcome. So, boys and girls, today is the 25th of January 2020. On the 20th of January, not February, 2020, at 7:05 p.m, a message appeared on my WhatsApp, and the message referenced the title of this lecture, Towards Gutter Mysticism and a sub-real. What is a sub-real? I received this message from a friend of mine who works in teaching art theory, art criticism at the Courtauld Institute, the wonderful Catherine Howe. And I was asking her, could you give me some background to this? You know, I need a bit more information about the Surrealists and Paris in the 1920s. And she sort of said, hold on, before I did do that, let me tell you something. I'll read it word for word. There is a great deal of scholarship, wrote my friend, assistant lecturer at the Courtauld Institute of Art in London, Catherine Howe, Dr. Catherine Howe. She said, on surrealism and magic, there's a lot already written. My face dropped and my guts spilled. I thought, shit, I don't have anything original to offer. Especially alchemy. There's a lot already written on your subject, Pascal. A friend of mine has written a lot about this, and here's the important bit. I would avoid the term subreal. I would avoid the term surrealism because actually a lot of what you've already talked about are very surrealist things. One man, which we'll talk a lot about, Bataille, the author of this collection of essays, Visions of Excess, Eroticism, Literature and Evil, and the famous novels, The Story of the Eye. He is sitting there, patiently waiting for us. Georges Bataille is a man, according to Catherine, has written a lot about your so-called sub-realism, your cheap, plastic, marketable term, sub-realism. Okay, she didn't really say that, but I'm paraphrasing. So you've already discussed this. This has already been discussed, The voice of authority, the voice of academia powering down on me like some Old Testament God onto my crippled, desert-wrinkled skin. But I said to myself, while cold sweating in my bed the following morning, how about we actually go ahead and use the term subreal as a new form of surrealism, and in fact the whole basis of this first lecture will be something that was more inspired by the idea of a lecture that is outside the boundaries of a lecture, the idea of, say, in a Prague pub where you talk with your professors and the lecture really gets breathed into and the oxygen enters and people actually start talking about what really matters using accessible language, or like you might imagine, texting your professor and asking them about certain things, or just going down the pub and talking to someone who knows what they're talking about and they actually happen to use, unlike our friend Georges Bataille, they actually happen to use accessible language which anyone can understand. But wait, I started reading Georges Bataille many years ago. I got really interested in him and his place within surrealism, but I realized that something was missing, a term that we could all use and put onto fridge magnets: subreal. Why am I so obsessed with this idea of a subreal? Well, we'll come to that a bit later, but Catherine, my friend, said Bataille's use of base materialism already covers this topic. His feud with the original surrealist André Breton has already covers this topic. And Dali's fascination with shit, masturbation and liquidity is already an expression of the subreal. So, in other words, forget it. Of course I'm exaggerating. Catherine wasn't quite that horrible to me, but that's the sort of magnification of my fear of the academy, of universities, that has made this whole thing into a kind of paranoid joke. But this was simply days I received this text before starting this lecture series, and I felt I was found out. I had been apprehended. I had been discovered to be the fraud that I am. Who knows if that's true? Where was I going to turn, and how was I going to confront this impossibility of nothing new being under the sun, that my originality suddenly had burst, the balloon of my so-called talent was gone? Well, how about we actually capitalize on the lack of originality of my thought and actually continue with it and press it enough times into your imaginations that actually maybe some new formulations of surrealism might get compounded in your brains and we all live a more enlightened life. Who knows? Maybe it was just fun to sit around and listen to someone's voice. The whole point of us sitting down here and listening to one person speak is quite unusual, especially in a context surrounded by traffic noise, the noise of the assembly over there of the centre, the sphere of Portugal's politics revolving around this one focal point, and of course digital media, all of these things focusing our attention away from the centre, whereas the subreal and the focus on surrealism in general is a focus on an inner reality. Surrealism was never an escape from reality. It was a beyond reality. It was a form of realism that happened to go into dreams. But we'll come to that later. So it's time to start exploring the whole situation of what we're doing here, why we're listening to my quasi-new theory on surrealism. What actually has happened? Well, I've decided to explore this situation, and interestingly, in Portuguese, the word for explore is the same word for exploit. I think that's very clever sort of subconscious expression of Portugal's idea of their colonies, which they lovingly call the discoveries. Oh, there it is. So why don't we exploit the idea of you happening to sit down with me, listening to my nonsense. I have just turned 30. I lost my job, and I decided to make good use of my time. And instead of sitting in a cafe and looking at pretty girls walk past and feeling depressed because I'm not really doing anything, I thought, why don't I actually construct a situation where I can not really get paid for this, but at least get admiration for it, and maybe I might meet some brilliant people and they might give me money eventually. So as I said, I just turned 30, sort of pre-midlife crisis, who knows. I hadn't made a cent from my writing. I've always wanted to be a writer, got very disillusioned, had a very successful journalist brother. And I thought, well, why don't I sort of rubber stamp a concept? Why don't I almost commodify an idea that I've had and sell it to some very credulous, what's the word where people believe things easily? Gullible people. So first place I turned to, of course, was no, I'm joking. Zay and Gemma at Zaratan were really, really positive and really helpful in for some bizarre reason, inviting me here to do this, for not just once, but another 3 times after this. And I thought that this was a way that I could, in a way, eventually get paid to sit in one of Lisbon's, kiosk cafes and look at the peacocks walk past and pretend that this was a vocation, instead of my 30 years of just writing for free for various magazines and online places, and it all being pissed away and no one really reading it eventually. No, maybe through the process of doing these lectures, we might be able to carve out an actual theory, an actual practice. This is why it's called a towards a gutter mysticism, towards a subreal, not landing on it as well. this is my desperate attempt at providing meaning for my own life. You just, I've got to have a deadline. I won't do it if I don't get a deadline. So this is precisely the deadline in real time, as you can hear me speak. It is the case of, and the inspiration of our favourite rock star, the glam figure Alice Cooper, that this sort of lecture series is sort of thrusted. Alice Cooper, as we all know throughout his records, wasn't the most original of artists, but he decided to perform. He decided to give massive spectacles, and it wasn't about originality. The whole misconception of artistic creation is that it needs to be original. It's absolute nonsense. It just needs to be presented in a better way. So the whole point of this lecture is to try and present often restricted ideas in the academe, in the university life, in a way that is accessible, as if this whole lecture was a sort of WhatsApp message. So, as I am talking to my friend Catherine. I would avoid those words again from my friend Catherine Howe. I would avoid the use of the term subreal echoing in my head, even as I give this lecture, paranoid that I'm not covering any new ground. But we will have eventually a process where we will talk, relax, have a little break, go to the toilet, and then we'll move on, and then I'll actually get to the subreal. Let's introduce a gentleman into the figure now to get into a little bit more of the meat of the matter. Georges Bataille is a man from France. He grew up in the early 20th century. He's sitting there waiting for us. He had a syphilitic father, or his dad had syphilis, who died young. He grew up wanting to be a Catholic priest. He was very much interested in surrealist ideas, psychic automatism, or the idea of using your dreams as a form of language to attain the real. So we have the word real in surreal. And the problem with sur and surreal is that it's an idea of transcending and going up and going beyond. Whereas I think Bataille unconsciously was going for something more base, to use his word. He was using for the below, the bottom, these kind of, as the alchemists call it, the negredo being the lowest of the low, the kind of terrible, disgusting matter you start with in the alchemical process before you go on to create gold. So Bataille is famous for cultivating a sort of almost like a cult of darkness, not like some kind of cheap goth, but actually someone who used perverse, bizarre ideas in order to attain a kind of inner alchemy, inner mysticism. And that's part of the lecture title that has completely escaped me for the last 15 minutes. Inner alchemy. Inner alchemy is a big theme of these lectures. Inner alchemy is a term not originating from our friend, Mr. Bataille, but coming a bit earlier. The origins are not so clear, but inner alchemy is probably a term from the early Taoists, the Taoist writers from ancient China, who believed, as did a lot of European Enlightenment alchemists, they believed that alchemy was actually a spiritual process, not a literal physical idea of turning shit into gold, but the idea of turning your own internal processes into a kind of endless or eternal substance. And that's going to be a thing that kind of ties everything together. The form of knowledge that I want to celebrate is a form of knowledge which comes from our bodies, not from our heads, not from the cerebral cortex, so to speak. This is something that just bleeds or seeps or oozes or drops or drips from our own processes. How you can attain this system of corporeal knowledge, I'm not really probably going to go into great depth. And in a sense, I would think it's best to sort of explore it in your own way. You may use music or drugs, or you might use meditation. That's up to you. But in order to not swallow too many concepts all at once and then vomit them out to all of you, we'll just stick to the three main processes of bodily secretion. So in the next lectures, I'll talk about laughter. I'll talk about crying, connecting with laughter, and I'll talk about, in the third lecture, urination, pissing, and the final lecture, anal alchemy, of course, shitting, which is my concept for artistic creation. All of this is to get away from the idea of originality. All of this is to get away from the idea of the starving artist in his or her attic, suffering for the benefit of mankind. All of this is the idea that artistic creation is something completely embedded within daily routine. That's absolutely inseparable from shitting, urinating, laughing, crying. It's such an ordinary process that you'll find in lots of languages there is no word for music. In Ghana, in Mali, in many West African countries with local languages, there is no word for music because music is just part of everyday life. It's absurd to kind of anatomize this sphere of life. So we'll talk a little bit, hopefully today as well, about laughing and the chakra in the solar plexus potentially. But for now, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to turn to also the idea of mimicry and copying. If originality is overvalued, if we need to sort of get away from that idea and move on to a world of confidence where we can confidently make our own art without worrying about being original, maybe we should turn to the Japanese. The Japanese have successfully originated, ironically, their own valuing of not copying, not originality, I've said it already, but of copying, of more to the point, mimicry. Japan has a huge culture of covers bands, for example. Some of you may be able to explain this a little bit better than me, but I read quite a bit by an author called Simon Reynolds, who covered whole music scenes in Japan, which delved into this idea of expert imitation, the idea of having a master and totally following your master. You wait for your master to die, then you imitate them perfectly. That is not something that is devalued in Japanese culture. And in a sense, if you are able to just bang out, to print so much of the sort of the same idea in various different ways, that is your way to become, in certain terms, successful. What you might mean by successful differs, but in my own terms, if you want to become, you could say, a public intellectual, I'm putting my cards right there on the table, public intellectual is someone who doesn't make people feel small. People like Christopher Hitchens, if you're not a religious person. I am a religious person, but I do love Christopher Hitchens. Christopher Hitchens was a man who didn't say many original things a lot of the time. Christopher Hitchens happened to manage to travel around the world and just vomit out the same stuff to such a convincing degree. He had enough presence to do so that he was able to build a career out of it. So, in a way, I'm advocating a kind of charlatanism, a way of selling a cheap idea very, very well. So, it comes back to also the process of people coming in and sitting down and making themselves comfortable and listening to one madman, deranged, flooding the room with certain ideas. This is not so different from me holding up a stick and connecting the stick together is long steel strings, and part of the steel, so the structure is a coiled wire which connects to some speakers. It couldn't be more contrived. This is one long phallic piece of orgasmic joy. The guitar itself, its own kind of voice, its own kind of technology, is what we all go and see. A lot of the weekends we go out, we see a band play and strum away. My friend Phil Todd of the Astro Navigations, so I'm name checking here, but he did say something interesting. Astro Navigations is the name of Phil Todd's project, Leeds-based underground artist, who mentioned in an interview, which I can't find, how ridiculous it is to be out there soloing away on your guitar, and people are taking you seriously. This kind of masturbation project, broadcast, as the word comes from, broadcast is to sow seeds of musical, I don't know, semen into the fertile ears of a metropolitan audience. It is quite a fascinating situation we find ourselves in, to just be listening to one person, especially nowadays when we're not so used to just sitting down and listening to speeches. Preachers only 300, 200 years ago would preach for hours and hours. It was completely normal to go down into the village square and there'd be a new speaker and they would be granted however long they want to sprout or sow their own seeds. So what we're doing now may feel a bit different, but I'd like to bring back the idea of public speech. Leitura is a nice word. I like the idea of reading, a reading. Of course, I'm not really reading, kind of ad-libbing, but there's no word for what we're doing. I used to call this palestras de palermas, or sort of lectures of bullshit, lectures of nonsense. This isn't really stand-up. It's just a performance, but I'm calling it a lecture. But the lectures that are going to be forthcoming, the lectures that will continue here, will be hopefully before concerts, before gigs. And I think it's a nice way to start a gig is to listen to some crazy guy talk about his ideas. So we're going to pause in a few seconds and we're going to have a little break. But before I do so, I would like to just welcome you to the beautiful fragrance of the incense, just to get us in the mood for getting deeper, because the gutter mysticism I propose is not a gutter mysticism where I stab you all and run away and smother my face with your blood. It's actually one to do with going down. Transcendence isn't something that is going up. Transcendence is something that goes down. It's as simple as that. By delving into ourselves, by diving into ourselves, by sort of spiraling inwards, we're able to achieve another sense of transcendence. We are not looking up into the skies, we're going into the sewers or the gutters of our own selves. So with this beautiful process of chopping up the life-giving sun, this is what we're eating. There are people who gaze at the sun and eat the sun and ruin their eyes. We're not going to do this, but we're effectively going to turn our heads inwards, but effectively reach the origin of all life, which is the sun. So we're going to have about 5-10 minutes break. This isn't really a break. This is actually my tactic to get nice questions from you to make you feel more relaxed. But if you have any questions for me, we're not sort of continuing the lecture. We're going to have 7.5 minutes break, in which time we're going to finish all of these oranges. Excellent. So please, Isabel, who I'm very grateful for helping me write these essays, Isabel is going to start dealing these oranges out. I'm going to zip up and we'll come back in 7.5 minutes. Any questions, come and talk to me. Thank you. Kind of worked, I guess, having this little break. I was just talking to Luke, Cass and Isabel a little bit about the Japanese thing, about mimicry being so highly valued. But it struck me that, there's actually whole economies based around imitation. Taiwan was a big example. Japan, the idea not of inventing, but of just perfecting. And this all based on the scenario of suffering and desolation. Japan, after the Second World War, no other country had received not even a single atomic bomb as a threat, but Japan. The so-called tiger economies in Southeast Asia recovering from sheer economic deprivation, colonialism, Singapore, Malaysia, Taiwan being economies that didn't really make anything up. They just chucked it all out. They managed to reproduce and provide products in a cleverer, more regimented way. So a little bit of economics for a Saturday night. Also, what better way to spend a Saturday night than getting small pieces of orange lodged in your teeth, especially when you're giving a lecture. Let me also make a big point that I forgot to mention earlier on. We're in Portugal. I'm not speaking Portuguese, and I realise very, very strongly how a lot of us Brits come here and don't make an effort with your language and use really difficult technical language and expect you all to go, I know exactly what you mean. If I say anything that was, and this includes native speakers as well, if I say anything completely nonsensical, please interrupt me or just throw a bit of used orange peel at my pointy face. So do feel free to interrupt the lecture, or just contribute any questions or whatever. It's difficult to know where to start with such an enormous topic, but I think maybe we'll use the inspiration of the lectures Georges Bataille, over there, the photograph of him over there, a man who, in his own words, viewed brothels as his own chapel. What a wonderful idea. Georges Bataille, again, the French theorist, who, when I began reading, getting obsessed with, I enjoyed him so much to my own detriment. I thought, this guy's so wonderful, but what is he saying? He must be contradicting himself. He definitely doesn't mean that. And then you realise, I smell a rat. And I smell a particular kind of rat, the worst kind of rat, which is a French rat, speaking as a Brit. So I thought it would be a great idea to start doing battle and sparring with our decadent, syphilitic French cousins, the French theorists of the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s of the 20th century, to start actually a dar luvas, like giving gloves, as we say in Portuguese, start battling with them. The whole idea of continental philosophy, as we say in England, continental philosophy, analytical philosophy, as if there was this huge divide and nothing could marry them. Well, that's exactly what we're going to do today. We're performing a ceremonial ritual of starting the bride, French theory, and strong, muscular British philosophy. Yes, the two shall meet and a marriage will be long and plentiful and involve, of course, lots of sexually transmitted diseases, because we're all focusing on the darkness and the sexual and the erotic. After all, one of his books, Georges Bataille, is called Eroticism, which I have to say is remarkable and attractive every so often, and then most of it is completely unreadable. And I think we need to be brave. Bravery, courage, commitment are things that are going to come back into the next few lectures. We need to be brave enough to say and sit down and stare eye to eye with people like Sartre, Roland Barthes, Deleuze, all those guys with cool names that we like to reference. We think we're cool because we don't really understand them, let's face it. If you look at their writing, it's impenetrable. It's very badly written, and then it gets little nuggets, little gleams of glory. These and I'm going to say it's the French, goddamn French. They were wonderful thinkers. They were delightful surrealists. There's a reason surrealism didn't really spring from the ground of good old Albion of Britain. No, it comes out of Paris, the disease-ridden, impoverished city, the capital of France, the head of decadence of intellectual Europe. There's a reason the French came up with all these amazing art forms and ideas. There's a reason why artists travelled from all over the world to be there and live there and breathe in the smoke and the dirt and enjoy the brothels, or the brothels/chapels of Georges Bataille. We need to have our own commitment to these men like Georges Bataille. We need to have the bravery to say they couldn't write. It's simple as that. If we, instead of trying to disentangle their words and say, well, they were disrupting hierarchical forms of thinking and they were trying to encourage the reader to bear the idea of contradiction within them, we are giving them a pass and we're excusing what is basically a nihilistic, misanthropic idea of human life. Oh, you're not going to understand what I'm going to write. That's because either you're too stupid or you're hoping for monumental truth. Georges Bataille, I believe, was a nihilist. Deleuze, Roland Barthes, even Breton, these guys, they, in fact, I believe, deep down, didn't believe in human truth. They believed in the real, but they didn't align it with the truth. That's why they wrote so terribly. So I'm saying that there is something in the waters, there's something in the Seine of Paris, which if you fall into, you will turn mad, because you'll be in Seine. Right? One pun every lecture. That's my favourite joke of this year. Never mind. But maybe that's the point. There's something about the Parisian water that makes you write so badly while having such attractive ideas. The idea of Nietzsche at the end of his life, the syphilitic mess, coming out with his his brain being sunburned by his own genius, not being able to write properly. So, commitment to the idea that these gentlemen, and it was mainly gentlemen, couldn't write properly. But what do I mean? It seems simple to say, you can't write properly, you're being stupid. In fact, the act of stupidity, the phenomenon of stupidity, is actually quite a complicated process. Stupidity is a manifestation of rather deep processes of avoidance of the truth, avoidance of difficult, complex ideas. Stupidity is, in fact, a certain entanglement of your own bodily processes. So, in fact, these guys were really rather stupid and couldn't write properly, as I've said a million times. But you can judge someone's ideas, as you can probably tell right now, you can judge someone's ideas by their form, of course. You can read someone's form of ideas and, judging on the way it's constructed, decide, well, maybe they're not a very coherent thinker in the first place. There may be really, really clever ideas, but it simply wasn't presented well. And the fact of presentation itself is a form of thinking. I might be saying that in a really profound way. It might not be a very novel idea, but you get my point, that these guys themselves might be kind of in their own intellectual quicksand, and it's the responsibility, of course, of the superior race of the Brits to come along and order their ideas. I'm joking, of course. It's all up to us to kind of put all of their ideas into order. And in fact, possibly even not classify but encourage new forms of art like Joana Baez's comics or bandas desenhadas, and look at her work, a contemporary comic book writer, and look at her as a kind of sub-realist potentially. So we'll get to Joana in a second, my beloved Joana. But for now, I think before we'll get to her, I'll just quickly read one or two things, as I promised, from Georges Bataille. Georges Bataille, in an essay, the essay is called The Big Toe. He liked to write essays according to the rotten sun, the mouth, the eye, the pineal gland. He was interested in anatomy, and speaking as a yoga Pilates teacher, I also find this really quite interesting. So I'm going to read one quote from The Big Toe. And before I do this, let's bear in mind, these were not preachers from the 17th century. Okay, those guys are good to listen to. They were poetic. This guy, they're all about reading. They've forgotten that humans, for most of living human history, ever since we've used words, we've been listening to each other. We haven't been writing. So this stuff is really not built for the lecture format, but let's just give it a go. The big toe. Although within the body, blood flows in equal quantities from high to low and low to high, there is a bias in favor of that which elects itself, and human life is wrongly seen as elevation. Human life is wrongly seen as elevation. The division of the universe into subterranean hell and perfectly pure heaven is an indelible conception. Indelible being the idea of staining, the impossible contact, or the impossible to remove contact of an idea of heaven and hell, and that duality being inescapable. The division of the universe into subterranean hell and perfectly pure heaven is an indelible conception. Mud and darkness being the principles of evil, as light and celestial space are the principles of good. With their feet in mud, but their heads more or less in light, men stubbornly imagine a tide that will permanently elevate them, never to return into pure space. Human life entails, in fact, the rage of seeing oneself as a back and forth movement from refuse to the ideal. So from like litter, from junk to heavenly concepts, and from the ideal to the refuse. A rage that is easily directed against an organ as base as the foot, which is why Bataille spends a lot of time talking about the fetishizing of feet, for example, in Chinese culture, this being completely unknown to us Westerners, who would be us blushing at the sight of a female ankle, of course. Not today, but that was something frightfully unimaginable not so long ago, 200, 300 years ago. The sight of a woman's ankle would be enough to cause you not just to blush, but to leave the room. So he's looking down. He's avoiding this idea of transcendence as a leap up into the cosmos. But I believe in order to what do we want to do? We want to go straight down and just put our heads in the sand or wallow around in the mud? No, I do think we can't avoid the leap upwards. We really do feel transcendence as something that does bring us out of ourselves. Ecstasy is literally being taken out of your body. So we're going somewhere with transcendence. It might not necessarily be up, but it's certainly a sense of expansion. The ground doesn't always make us feel very expansive or open. So from the solar anus, as Schickel has identified, he said, Pascal, you're reading an essay called The Solar Anus. Tell me about it. The Solar Anus is one of those essays that Bataille managed to capture. It with just the title, he's got, I think, the whole concept, the solar anus. What a fantastic combination of words. The surrealists were always great at combining impossible ideas. The chance encounter of an umbrella and... Anyone know the end of that? I can't remember what it is. A chance encounter, thank you, Isabel and Gemma. A chance encounter of an umbrella and a sewing machine. That was written in the 1890s or something, but that was picked up by the surrealists as a fantastic encapsulation of this impossible conjunction of ideas that brings a sense of, for me, aesthetic bliss. The solar anus, an abandoned shoe, a rotten tooth, a snub nose, the cook spitting in the soup of his masters are to love what a battle flag is to nationality. An umbrella, a sexagenarian, a seminarian, the smell of rotting eggs, the hollow eyes of judges are the roots that nourish love. It's very French to connect everything to love. A dog devouring the stomach of a goose, a drunken vomiting woman, a sobbing accountant, a jar of mustard represent the confusion that serves as the vehicle of love. It's these shorter essays where you get these condensed combinations of impossible concepts which Roland Barthes would say that will give you a kind of textual bliss. We'll talk about, I think he was a little bit younger. He was from a slightly later generation. Also, he committed the crime of being French. His name is Roland Barthes. Roland Barthes, being from a different generation, writing more in the 60s and 70s, but he spent a lot of time in Japan. And the empire of science, and he talked a lot about the emptiness, the Zen-like approach of, Japanese cuisine. He was openly obsessed. That's what was so attractive about him. Not so much with darkness. Roland Barthes was very much curious about pleasure, and he weaved his idea of ecstasy and textual pleasure into a whole book. He wrote a book called The Pleasure of the Text, where he wrote, something like this. I'm paraphrasing, it's years since I've read this, but I want to read a book as if I'm watching a stripper and I want to jump on to the stage and tear off her clothes. And he says her clothes, being a bit careful with his language. He was practicing homosexual. I don't like that term, but yeah, he was an active homosexual in the 60s, 70s, I believe. Maybe roughly around that time. But yeah, he also, like I guess Bataille, had no apology for his obsessions. One thing I'd like to reference is Bataille never worked in universities, and I'm still criticizing him of exclusive nihilistic language, but credit to Bataille, he was always outside of that sphere. He worked as a librarian. He was a specialist in coins and medieval history. So he was a very unfashionable guy, but he managed to get a lot of people together. He is said to have introduced Nietzsche to France, whatever that means. But Roland Barthes was, I guess, and this is where, I'm sidetracking a little bit, but it might come up, it might be helpful. I don't know if this is all connected to history, because, again, just to hit the head of the modern generation, we're terrible at dealing with history nowadays. We don't give enough credit to our ghosts and our historical neighbours, so to speak, with anything, really. We're just not curious about history nowadays because we think we're really advanced, really modern, really clever, and that's why Twitter has revolutionized thinking and bollocks. Absolute nonsense. Social media has not really fundamentally changed all the questions we're asking about ourselves. So the first person to come along who would say, don't read biography, doesn't matter, enjoy the text, take the clothes off the stripper is Roland Barthes. Roland Barthes himself would absolutely avoid it, just enjoy the fluidity of the text, the basically art for art's sake. I mean, it's a bit lazy to say that. I don't agree with him. I delightfully disagree with him. I think if you want to actually get underneath and enjoy more, you fall in love, you want to know about the background history of the person you've fallen in love with, and learn more eventually about yourself. That's the true lesson of love. I'd never expected on a Saturday night to be talking about love in public to people. So the obsession with biography should only be to provide, not gossip, because we could all talk about funny things that happened in whoever's life. Roland Barthes died after being run over by a laundry van, and he let himself die because his mother had died 2 weeks ago or something. Interesting gossip, right? But that's not what we're here to do. So I think this is all about, luckily, to do with the sun and staring into the heart of creation. Okay, it's an ambitious project for Saturday night, but not just the sun, the rotten sun. This might take a bit of time to explain, so please bear with me. But our figures. Okay, today we've had a guy step in, an invisible presence, Roland Barthes with Georges Bataille. Both probably would very much be very careful, very apprehensive of exploring biography and getting obsessed with the day-to-day lives of, and that's had become very unfashionable by the time they had passed away. I think people were into this kind of, and it's the first time, probably the only time I'm going to use this word, but the postmodern idea of simply referencing and taking and putting together with total disregard for origin and for history. But I think we've now come back, and I think postmodernism has exhausted itself. It already had exhausted itself, and postmodernism and our generation are arrogant enough to think that, well, our historical neighbours are ghosts, the previous generations, they didn't know what they were doing, they were worshipping, they were using tarot, or they were fortune telling, or they were using strange herbal mixtures which killed themselves. Of course they did, they made mistakes, they didn't perfect things. But I think we're now at a point where we need to just listen to the modernists were asking exactly the same questions we need to be asking right now. And in fact, the big genre, the big form of art that really, really feeds all of what I argue is subreal is noise. It's noise music, particularly Japanese noise music starting from the late 70s, which itself was avowedly surrealist, particularly the noise music of Mertzbay, or real name Masami Akita. The lowbrow, the pornography of music is noise, and if Bataille has given us anything, it's the idea that we forget high and lowbrow, or we mix the both, or by going low we reach the high, and there's some kind of transcendent echoing noises that we can attain, I guess. So I'm going to come back to try to pin this down by talking about the sun. Because the sun comes up a lot, as we had the solar anus from the previous essay of Bataille. But the last thing I'll reference from Bataille today, and I will tie it up in about 5-10 minutes, is a little slip of Bataille's essay, Rotten Sun. And I mentioned the sun earlier as being, of course, the source of all creation. It's an impossibility. We can't look at it. We shouldn't look at it. Yet we, and for most of human history, have worshipped it. The sun, from the human point of view, is the most elevated conception. It is also the most abstract object, since it is impossible to look at fixedly at any time of day. If we describe the notion of the sun in the mind of one whose weak eyes compel him to emasculate it, that sun must be said to have the poetic meaning of mathematical serenity and spiritual elevation. If, on the other hand, one stubbornly focuses on it, a certain madness is implied. He talks a lot about Van Gogh having stared at the sun before he cut his own ear off and sent it to a prostitute. But refuse or combination or combustion adequately expressed by the horror emanating from a brilliant arc lamp. In practice, the scrutinized or the observed sun can be identified with a mental ejaculation, foam on the lips, and an epileptic crisis. I'll just repeat that. In practice, the observed sun, or the scrutinized sun, can be identified with a mental ejaculation, foam on the lips, and an epileptic crisis. This brings me to bodily knowledge, corporeal knowledge. Knowledge that comes from you is a kind of chemical that oozes, that bursts through or drips either by accident or deliberately through dreams or active meditation or the consumption of psychedelic drugs. In the same way that the preceding sun, the one not looked at, is perfectly beautiful, the one that is scrutinized, the one that is viewed, can be considered horribly ugly. It's not a long essay. He goes on to talk about gross violence, but to go, in my view, to go into historical biography, to go into finding the details of the dangerous task of going into historical detail, is like staring at the sun. It's very, very dangerous, and it can produce some kind of innate ejaculation or dripping or oozing or seeping that goes beyond your own possibility of modifying your ideas. So you'll come to conclusions that you don't want to, that are innate, and that could be its own kind of sub-realist thoughts. So to finish, and I promise you I will finish today, I'm going to just jump onto two things. The first thing is, when we come into staring at the sun and historical validity within literature and so on, what I'd like to say is this. We should inhabit that risk. We should completely jump into that difficulty of weaving in historical interpretation, in the same way that as a Brit living abroad, I should inhabit the cliche of being British, but maybe, to use a more contemporary phrase, to queer it, so to speak. So by being uber British, you're actually more British than, say, people living in England, but you're queering the idea of British. So you're exploring the actual innate qualities of what Britishness means, or being British means, but you're outlining that itself is a kind of historical construct, and it's kind of very arbitrary. I'll give you I've laboured the point, but give you one example. Tea being fundamentally British. The British can't get up in the morning without having their strong dose of tea. It's actually true. The British are completely mad about it. We stole it off the Chinese. You Portuguese claim to originate tea. It's half true. We'll talk about Catherine de Braganza after the lecture. But the point is, an inherently British thing couldn't have happened without the violence of colonialism, couldn't have happened without the exploitation of the Bengalis, the Sri Lankans, the mass plantations over stolen land and so on. But let's inhabit that. Let's look at that historical reality. Let's look into that stunt to do the impossible and inhabit the cliche and queer it and make it our own and demonstrate this is all completely nonsense in the first place. We should celebrate, maybe in that kind of open way that postmodernists would do, celebrate the superficiality of cultural traits. Thank you for your patience, Cass. From porridge, oats and porn, how did we get there? Joanna Baez made a really fantastic book, so fantastic I don't know the name by heart. It's Bruma. Bruma is like mist, right? Like mist, fog, Bruma. It's on a really, really special comic book, public, what do you say? Editora? Yeah. What do you say in English? People who publish things are publishing house. Chili con Carne, who is based right by your house, by the way, in the Olivais, Biblioteca das Bandas Desenhadas, or the Biblioteca, Joana Bruma. Now fica em Olivais. Your apology is accepted, Gemma. So, getting a bit into her stuff, I really see, not just in her, she's just one of many, but in particularly very, very new comic books, this idea of seepage and globular figures, squashy ideas, piercing, disgust. I hear it a lot in modern experimental dance music, particularly of Lisbon's Rotten Fresh label, which is based not so far away, made by basically a bunch of kids in the area. They must have played here a few times. Joana Baez, I think, explores real deep subreal territories. Okay, I don't want to classify her and pin her down and force this label onto her, but I think it's nice to think about her as a kind of erotic transcendent, or a kind of base mysticism. So I think I will just sort of give this round and allow you all to enjoy, I would say, possibly quite a psychedelic visual form, and encourage you all to go to Oliveich on the red line of the metro and see for yourselves in the very, very wonderful modern collection of the BDteca, or the Biblioteca das Bandas Desenhadas, some of these borderline psychotic, psychedelic, seeping, cutting, globular, spitting images, which are part of this dream world of a modern generation, all unconsciously tapping into the subreal, into the inner alchemy of gutter mysticism. I'm going to end there. This has been a really long lecture, so thank you so much, and please come next week, 2 weeks. Thank you. So yeah, just to let you know, just so you're relieved, I have texted my mum, and what did she say? She said, my treasure, something like this. What did she call me? I told her, please bear in mind that although it's supposed to start at 8 p.m, it's Portugal, so expect a delay. My mum says, have we got to listen live? It's like, as if we're forced to. No, Mum, I will make a recording. There's also videos. Some say excessive angles being used, but then Mum says, because she's a linguist, bon, if I'm free, I will listen live, but Dad and I might be watching something. Reminds me of my bandmate. He said, yeah, I'll come, but I might watch the final of the Tassa. I might watch the final of the football. Okay, so there you go. We're good to go, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the lecture. Things are flying from the notepads. Chaos is the norm. It's Zaratan. Let me first of all say thank you to Gemma and Zé for their hospitality. I brought my own wine. But thank you for the hospitality, just because I'm saving money. And for just going along with this crazy self-imposed regime of me avoiding the inevitable insignificance of my own life and instead preaching to innocent people on a Saturday night about the chakras. So thanks to Zé and Gemma once again. Second thing, before we actually get started, is we are in fact listening to English, and I appreciate the native, I think the native language of this country isn't English. I think it's some dialect of Spanish, but we're not speaking Portuguese, and I do acknowledge that. If I do say stuff that's completely incomprehensible, if I do mention something that doesn't make sense, even for native speakers, please do interrupt. This is very much an interactive thing, and I want to invite you all to contribute in your own way, so don't be shy. Third thing, there will be a break, and we're going to have a break as my subtle tactic, my strategy on getting this, instead of being a lecture or even a performance, more of a start of something else, the start of potentially a reading group or a discussion group, and also a way in a country which I perceive as quite reluctant to contribute in these settings, in a country that does look at stages and feels the shadows of them. I want this to be a sense of the break of the lectures where you sort of step in and feel more comfortable to talk without the recorders on and without it being sort of recorded. Of course it is being recorded, but you don't know that. The important thing really is that this country does strike me as a country of stages. I'm supposed to be and trained to be a Pilates teacher, and sadly in this country I haven't been able to really find continuous work in this. But what I've noticed in the gyms where I've been working, I've had a lot of aulas de substituição, a lot of like cover classes, cover work. So I've worked all over the city. There's always a stage. There's always stages where the teachers work. There's always this elevation of the teacher with regards to the student or the pupil. So let's flatten those hierarchies. And of course the lecture itself. The lecture is defiantly incomplete and unfinished. I have, and I know you'll all be begging me, based on the introduction of this lecture on the viral agenda, Pinterest, and Facebook group. I won't go according to the plan. I have abandoned our good friend Georges Bataille. I've even left the handsome photograph of him at home, subconsciously abandoning him, because we won't hear so much from our friend Georges Bataille. Georges Bataille being early 20th century French thinker who talked a lot about disgust and shame and executions and pornography. He talked about the brothel being his chapel, and he's very much a reference point for a lot of these lectures. The lectures in general, and there are 4 of them, this is the second, deal with my not very original new term, subreal. The subreal as a rethinking of surrealism. The first lecture talked a lot about, or introduced the idea of an alternative to surrealism, an idea of going down instead of going up. Instead of the sur in surrealism, beyond, above, we go down. We plunge into the depths of human shame, of sexuality, and even into maybe a genre of disgust. Instead of the high, we go into the low brow. We talk about atmosphere, we talk about texture, we talk about particularly noise, the pornography of sound. Noise music as an art form, as an expression of this maybe base surrealism. So I hope I won't sort of take that whole definition for granted, and we'll come back to this later on. But that was the first lecture. The second lecture is to kind of locate this into the body as the subreal, and this kind of mysticism is a mysticism of what I call the gutter mysticism, and a kind of inner alchemy. So the idea that the body is the source of deep mystical knowledge, and that if we're going to get into the body, we have to go deeply in, we have to go down into the depths of our veins and arteries, and potentially into the realm dealt with by the Vedic texts, the chakras. So I think that's where we'll get started, and I'll stop doing these infinite introductions, perpetually delaying the pleasure of this lecture, because that's why we're here on a Saturday night. Why else are we going to be sitting in the cold with the smoke and the traffic noise, listening to some deranged British guy talking about chakra? Well, you're all here, so that's great, and I don't take your ears for granted here. I'm really curious about what it is we're actually doing here, and that's going to inform the lecture as well. So we'll start with Manipura. Manipura is Sanskrit for a particular chakra. There are debatable how many chakra there are. In fact, the idea of saying there are a certain number of chakras really misses the point. As sort of plain and simple as I can put it, I had an experience with this supposed chakra energy point, you could call it. I had a very disorienting and intense experience with a part of my body which is roughly here, above the belly button, roughly around the diaphragm. As soon as you start reading about chakra, and I promise you the extent of my reading has been Wikipedia, and that's it, and I'm not ashamed of that, by the way, you notice that the chakra, there's no sort of source, there's no ultimate destination of the chakra in terms of who writes what and who determines what the chakra are. The chakras are so multifarious. There are so many different colors to chakra. There's so many different petals and shapes and numbers and names. The point is, if I offer you my experience of a chakra, that's something you can take or leave. It's up to you to find your own position on this. This is nothing to do with 21st century tolerance and we'll all get along if we all respect each other's ideas. No, I'm taking a partisan view. I'm saying this is exactly how it is. And to go a little bit towards the subreal, Isabel, who's with us today, hello Isabel, offered in the last session an alternative reading of the subreal as something that was unshakably yours, something you cannot quite stroke away from your viewpoint. A subreal, the subreal is some kind of fundamental point of view which is very difficult to not see as true. So the subreal, in my case, this part of the body, in my experience, was infinitely green. How else can I explain it? Green and yellow are right in the middle of those two colours. It was something that spiraled from my body. The chakra really means a wheel. The original meaning of chakra is wheel. And there's a whole idea of generation, spontaneous generation being something that curves out from the body. And because we're in the realm of mysticism, we're in the realm of really quite imprecise ideas and abstract ideas, potentially this is what connects it to surrealism, and surrealism being the language of dreams. And so this is very much language, in my case, more of hallucination. But I found the solar plexus, the manipura, what I would call like the male vagina, actually, in this part of the body, the potential of being penetrated for a male particularly. I found this to be a very useful source for a symbolic destination of musical creation and creation in general. Why, I hear you cry? Well, thanks for asking. The solar plexus is very much in between two vital parts of creation, particularly musical creation. On the one side, we have the head at the top, and the other, the balls and the genitalia. So the solar plexus right in the middle of that is able to balance both of these extremes. And the first of many pretentious name-checking to go on today. Nietzsche is the guy who really nailed this middle point between Apollos and Dionysus, the cerebral and the guttural, or at least the sort of meat, the grit of creation. So why do I find that so significant? Well, I think music is precisely between that intersection between abstract, cerebral, intellectual, cold, airy, fairy, astral of the cerebral cortex, and right down in the solar plexus, the pelvic floor, the floor, the seating point of human desire, the genitalia. And music seems to be so precisely moving for us because it seems to hit both parts of the body. It seems to tickle our intellectual sides as well as really just speak and vibrate, quite literally resonate with those parts of the body. And to return to that shocking and scandalous idea, the male vagina. I think this is a particularly vital point in terms of many forms of spirituality, is unity and wholeness and what it means to be a blend. Partially the idea of a yin and a yang, of course, is balance of opposites. But this manipura, this solar plexus chakra, being a source of openness, particularly in the form, I guess, of a diamond, that being, of course, the vaginal shape as well, but being a potential source of penetration. I would take a few steps across to what generates this energy, the chakra sort of splurging of the feeling of generation. Well, first of all, we can talk about the idea of generation and development. Develop and desenvolver in Portuguese, just to teach you your own language for a second. Desenvolver means to, literally in terms of the etymology, means to quite literally unwind, not to relax, but to sort of scale forth from a source. And the feeling is of a spiral. Many times in this kind of mystical knowledge, we come to ideas of spiraling, development not being straightforward 1, 2, 3 A, B, C chronological process. It's an idea of returning to the source, which is much harder than saying moving on to different ideas. I hope this isn't sounding really dizzyingly abstract, but my point is that even this feeling of giving these lectures and preparing for them is never an idea of learning something new. It's always returning to something that I know and being able to present it to you in an accessible way. So it's nothing to do with being a pioneer. It's nothing to do with learning original ideas and presenting original ideas. It's just in reshaping, reforming what we already know. What's really hard in mystical practices is to learn the most obvious lessons, to find the things that are straight in front of your nose. So we get on to then the source of the first of the actions that I promised you in the description of this lecture, which is a discussion not of just of crying but of laughter. It strikes me that laughter has been a real quietly bristling topic, not really in mysticism but in philosophy. The laughter, especially hysterical laughter, coming right from this part, the diaphragm, this kind of the seat of a swing which lies in the body, which if you exercise it enough you become breathless and you become almost you could become almost shocked at your own reaction. You could become shocked at your own hilarity, your own hysterical, I should say, your hysteria at the most extreme point of laughter. And of course there's many flavors of laughter. There's like a little snigger, there's a whine. I spend a lot of time in the cinema. I'm interested how sort of laughter generates laughter. But I really believe true guttural, heaving laughter to be something that is really beyond comprehension, beyond straightforward understanding. This is why we find ourselves laughing to things we really disagree with, and why I'm really curious about not really edgy comedy, but comedy that really does go difficult places. We can go and talk about whether it's acceptable to joke about certain topics, rape, the Holocaust, to name a couple. I'm convinced that it is actually acceptable to do it. And I think this is the most political of the 4 lectures that I'm going to give. But to go back to, again, Isabel, sorry to embarrass you, but Isabel's suggestion that the subreal could be this seat of, whether you like it or not, the seat of your own take on the world, your own view, the one that you can't shake off, which is really problematic for a lot of people who don't believe in fundamental truth. And we're in the realm, as I said, Bataille. I don't know if we've got any other thinkers here, but a lot of what we in England call continental philosophers, the French critical theorists of the 50s, 60s, 70s, who basically, in my opinion, were nihilists and didn't believe in truth at all, and therefore wrote terribly and didn't want to become communicable in any way. I think it's important that once we deal with laughter, we deal with something really quite important: social justice, activism, politics. Hopefully, I'll try to explain this later, but the point is we're getting to a sphere that is amoral. Amoral in the very strict sense. Not immoral as in wrong and sinful and bad and inflicting pain on other people. Amoral should be really understood as a whole realm that has nothing to do strictly with morality. It's like a pre-moral area where then ethics steps in a bit later. So, I think I'll put that aside for a second. But in terms of us navigating this in a political sense, how might laughter bring us to a more political sphere? Well, this is my strong impression about, I'll first present my impression of where we need to go in order to fight politically. And I'm going to be as brutal as this. I'm not going to be sort of hesitant and offering just a terrain. I really think this is a way that we can move forward, politically speaking, in a social sense. I think we need to find the enemy. Who is the enemy? The enemy is not the right. The right wing own the myths. The right wing are the best at presenting myths. What our enemy is those right within us today, right? And we're speaking in a country which has very much been crippled by mutual suspicion from its 48-year-old dictatorship, the longest, I should add, we should all remember, the longest in Western European history. This society was kept suppressed, oppressed, however you put it, because of mutual suspicion. The Bid, or the secret police, was all of us, so to speak. We were all suspicious of each other, and we all collected suspicions of each other, which we could have used as a weapon against our neighbour. So this mutual lack of trust, of which Portugal has high rates of, in a study of which I can't name the date or the authors, but it's true, Portugal does have a real mutual distrust. What we really need to find, again, are those enemies within our own spheres. What strikes me as very, very exasperating about dealing with politics is not with the right, is not with those I fundamentally disagree with. That's fine. It's easy. It's actually fun to read people you disagree with. It's a good exercise. Go and read some Ayn Rand. It's excellent. But it's actually the left, the left who share all your views. I'm just going to take a sip here. And by the way, we'll have a break at some point, about maybe 10, 15 minutes, 15 minutes. Oscar Wilde, name checking again. True friends stab you in the front. I think it's great that we know who the enemy is in the small e of enemy, in the sense that the right, we know they're there. We know they've got all the great stories and the great myths, and they're brilliant at basically, in modern sense, being populist and talking to the masses. What we need to be really careful of is the people who are perverting the very ideas we champion and that we love so much. This is true in terms of my experience with music, people who appear to be practicing something I value really, really highly, noise music and experimental music, DIY music. But also those so-called friends who are ready to stab you in the back. The right wing and your true friend are those that will stab you in the front, to paraphrase Oscar Wilde. And I think we have come to such a dissolved and such a disrupted moment in politics that it's worth realising the hilarious depth of despair that we're presented with, politically speaking, right now. It's very tempting for any pretend faux intellectual to say this is the worst moment in human history. I realise that's what I'm getting to, but I can only live in the era that I'm living in, and it does strike me that the right and the left have been completely dissolved, thanks to, in my particular case, Tony Blair, who deliberately evaporated the left-wing ideals in order to jump in bed with the right in order to create a very successful brand of centrist politics. But also, in terms of we really don't know where we stand anymore. The right and the left have been very much dissolved, and those very people who are supposed to be championed by the left, who the left are supposed to speak to properly, those are the ones who are voting for the enemy. Again, I'm speaking from my very, very sort of partisan position as a Brit, and what recently happened with the failure of the left, failure of the Labour Party, and the championing of those old ideals. Regions which have been voting for the left for pretty much the whole time. There were constituencies in England that had never voted for any other party than Labour, were finally jumping in bed with the enemy. The reason for that is because the right know how to use myth, they know how to use narrative and stories, and the left are bloody useless. And I think the left are useless because they don't have a sense of detachment, they don't have a sense of humour. And that leads us to a state of what's the correct, what's the understandable response to something so shocking and awful. It's not crying, it's laughter. You see someone who has just been presented with the last piece of dreadful news. They grimace like this. They don't quite smile, but they grimace. They smile through the hurt, through the pain. If you hear someone laughing in the house next door, sometimes you're not sure if they're crying, and there is quite a curious meeting point between laughter and crying. Humankind cannot bear very much reality, from 4 quartets by T.S. Eliot. Humankind cannot bear very much reality. I think that's what happens as in some way a kind of evolutionary response to bad news. You just have to grin through it. Things have got so bad that you can only smile. So I think laughter can be an ironic standpoint, not ironic in terms of cleverer than you or holier than thou, distant kind of knowing perspective, but in a sense of, well, let's detach ourselves from our own points of view and realise how small we are with regards to world politics and to, I guess, the wider cosmos. But there's something really useful, I think, image of this. Ben, a friend of mine, Ben Woods, who's a theologian, said to me once, really offhand, he wasn't trying to make anything very profound here, but he said, it was talking about the grand old enemy, the witch of England, who all of us have kind of have bear or sort of experienced the shadow of, Margaret Thatcher. He said, Margaret Thatcher was, okay, it's just been casual, she was evil. We all know she's evil, but why was she evil? What's the characteristics of a real witch? He said she never laughed at herself. She was never able to make jokes. And that's very far removed from saying, oh, what she did to the miners and how she deregulated our economy to its inevitable peril. She couldn't laugh at herself. And when you can't laugh at yourself, you're clearly not someone very detached from your own politics. So we'll come back to that. There's a really nice image before we have our little tea break. But I think it's also locates us and where we are and what we're doing right now, which is being somewhere in between the intellect, between the academy, between the universities, and the pub or the strip club or the pasteleria, so somewhere right in between the head and the balls. And I think a lecture format is something that really feeds people. I think it's a really, whether you agree with me or not, whether you're enjoying this lecture or not, I think it's nice to just be bathing in the words of some moron. And there really appears to be no word for what's going on. I mentioned this in the last lecture. It's not a lecture. It's not really a performance. It's not stand-up. And I think we should, if anyone can contribute at this point or during the break, I've been trying to look at the history of public speech or the history of oratory. And there's really not much written apart from simple thing as people were in public squares, in courtyards just like this, in the market square for 200,000 years of human history, listening to speeches. And that was completely normal, and you could throw whatever at my face, and that was absolutely normal. And my suspicion is with this country, it's quite hard to get people to interact in a performance situation. But also, once you're here, and once you're actually with me, and we're all together, it's really easy to just sort of lay back and be sort of bathing in someone else's words. It's a primal human pleasure, what we're doing here. So I think, how long has we've gone quite a while, so it feels a little bit early to be doing this, 26 minutes gone, but we are going to have a little break right now. And will he just get on with it? Will he just get it over and done with? I've clicked my fingers, so you know it's happening. That is purely just for mixing these two recordings together, if that makes anything interesting. So with no branding continuing here in the lecture, shall we continue with Boys and Girls, Lecture 2 of Inner Alchemy and Gutter Mysticism, the sub-real for the everyday mystical practitioner. Welcome back, and thanks for staying around. Last week everyone went away. It was just me on my own. Ran away. I also learned from last week or last session to write shit down. Write down the interesting ideas that come up to you when you talk to people. Write down things like slug, echo chamber, technology, not understanding words, trust communication, burn leaves, full moon. It was quite an eventful break, so thanks for giving me that. I also had time to release into the void the continuation of these lectures. Lecture 3 will all be about urination, boys and girls, the third level of secretion emanating from our bodies. And this kind of inner alchemy we're dealing with is all about our bodies teaching us stuff. So really it's a kind of corporeal knowledge. It's a way that most of us will have been to university. I don't want to presume that, but it's typically the case here in Zaratan. We've all had good educations, that we spend too much time in our heads. And even in my own practices, my religious practices as a Quaker, I'm a Quaker, and I'll explain what that is in a second. But many people dealing with mysticism today spend way too much time either in this kind of airy-fairy new age, say what you like, pick what you feel, mysticism, or they spend too much time rationalizing spirituality, or dare I say, God. God is a word possibly we'll get to lectures 3 and 4. This is the second of 4. But for now, it's time to turn to Well, if you just give me a moment, because that's the Quaker way. I introduce Quakerism to you in the most Quaker way possible, is by introducing the concept of silence. Quakers believe in silence. I discovered Quakers while I was at university. The Quakers, well, to quake in English means to shake, and the early Quakers in England came from just before the Civil War. Don't forget, it wasn't the French that cut off their heads, their king's head, and their queen, and everyone else. The English got there first. Yes, we beat the French to it. The English cut off their king's head in 1649, if I'm not mistaken, in King Charles I. This was a time of great spiritual upheaval and doubt for many of the British at that time, and a time of huge spiritual experimentation. You can only drive around England today and see this in front of you. Methodists, Baptists, Unitarians, Seventh-day Adventists, dare I say Mormons, although Mormons are American, but you get my point. We have a whole palette of Christian mysticism in England that, again, any way I can bash the Portuguese on the head is to say it's worse. In this respect, Catholicism is puritanical and monolithic in this country. There really aren't many other options apart from Brazilian Baptist churches and a quiet pocket of polite Buddhists in a bustling city like Lisbon. This is not a very diverse town, spiritually speaking. England does have a huge amount of variety, and it's all of those early mystics that jumped on those ships and headed to America. So Quakers made their way to America. I didn't expect to be talking about Quakers, but Quakers believed in inner spirituality, which sounds mind-bogglingly simple and simplistic to us nowadays, but you have to grant them for being products of their time. England and Britain at that time did believe in priests. A lot of people really perceived spirituality as coming from the male priest. If you go to a Quaker meeting nowadays, you will not see priests, which in itself is a bit of a misunderstanding. In Quakerism, everyone is a priest, and that includes children as well. Children have a huge part to play in Quaker political action, Quaker history as well. And the big symbol of Quaker spirituality is silence, is this overwhelming, covering ideal of pure democratic community. Silence being the symbol that anyone can access the divine, and if they access it, they're very free to share it. So it's not just about silence. In Quaker meetings, anyone can contribute to the leadings of the way of light or of God. So I'm not quite sure how I got to Quakerism, but I will pull this lecture back down to earth and come back down to more of our enemies. Not just the left, our so-called friends who stab us in the back, but also to those mustachioed, garlic-smelling French continental theorists. Yes, the postmodernists, ladies and gentlemen. Those most determined to suck the life out of all form of intellectualizing. Inconvenient for me, therefore, is how attractive I find the ideas they discussed. So we are in the company again. Bataille is most definitely not a postmodernist. And crucial to say, he was a modernist. I think he was a surrealist. He was a man who wasn't sort of tainted by this hesitant cloud of deliberate unknowing and obscurationism, or whatever you want to call it. The modernists and the postmodernists were very, very keen on using extremely inaccessible language. Yet the surrealists, of which Georges Bataille had much to do with, surrealists were very curious about things that informed these lectures. They were curious about alchemy, they were interested in magic, and they were addicted to play. And it's very much, to my understanding, we need to rewrite the history of the surrealists in a sense of rediscovering how they did play. 1942, Duchamp in, I think it's New York, began an exhibition in a grandly decorated Manhattan flat. He put his exhibits across the flat, across the gallery, and he invited the audience to go in. And interesting for Marcel Duchamp, he wasn't there. That was his whole point of opening his galleries. He wasn't even there. That's true heroism to me. The true hero in Taoist ideas is the hero who doesn't want to be a hero. The reluctant hero is the true hero. So Duchamp is on that podium for me, and he instructed his assistants to do something to distract and to play and to twist the mere interpretation of the gallery opening. His assistants were children, and the children were instructed to play in front of all of the people going into the gallery. You can imagine a lot of well-dressed, socially climbing art critics and art practitioners just being like distracted by kids. And Duchamp said to the kids, if anyone asks you what you are doing, you tell them from me that I asked you to just keep playing. Okay, so I find this delicious, a delicious idea to disrupt your own the audience's interpretation of your own art, to deliberately shake the whole framework of public and artistic discourse. Not only did he do this, as if this wasn't enough, I think he kind of over-egged the cake here. He spun twine or corda across the gallery to elbow-aching extents that he managed to succeed in precipitating the audience to fall over themselves. So there was a cord or twine or string going across the room, deliberately kind of disrupting the very interpretation of his own art. I think that's all about play. And I struggle to find any other obvious moments of play apart from Paul Klee, another surrealist, in early surrealist work. But there's the not quite surrealist, but the modernist drive of the Milan-based futurists in the 1910s. Let's put aside for a second they were all fascists. Let's forget that bit, because they were quite attractive young men in many ways. The futurist, I futuristi, the early futurists of Milan believed in disruption in, I think, an equally playful way. The intona rumori, or the noise instruments of the futurists in Milan, were a deliberate fuck you to all this kind of built-up Rococo classical music, which was so much encrusted in Italian music at the time and still right to this day. They went to an extent of arguing to destroy art galleries. Again, a delicious idea, especially to suggest this in such a place as Zaratan. But the Intorno Rumori of Russolo was the first noise musician, the first modern noise musician, in my opinion, so early that he predates kind of proper recording technology, or at least in Milan, there's not much of his stuff recorded. It took for late 1970s Japan to actually pick up on the ideas of the intorno rumori, or the noise instruments of 1910s fascist Milan. But the idea of causing disruption, like Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, generating riots, that was all part of the fun and the plan and the rock and roll of these men. And rock and roll is the spirit we will come to when we discuss not a surrealist, not a futurist, but very much a man of the grit and the dirt, and, in my opinion, the subreal, Lester Bangs, the number one, I think, rock critic of all time. I don't even want to say something as monumental as that. A great rock critic. Lester Bangs is someone we'll come to a bit later. But to turn to a kind of rock and roll that's still happening, the spirit of this generation of eternal adolescence, is the music of which you'll hear maybe after the lecture. I made a wee mix, a little mix for us to listen to during the lecture. And what comes next in the mix is very much a kind of music which is perceived to be divorced from the body and to pagan drives, electronic dance music. We should just talk about a kind of digital or digitalized music in terms of just electronic dance music, instead of getting our heads buried in things like deep house or post-industrial blah blah blah. We should instead just say this whole realm is digitalized or abstract dance music. Dance music is the source of all future or of all modernist music making, according to the DJ Jeff Mills. And I will play after the lecture a couple of songs or tracks from Aphex Twin and from Orteca, both UK-based projects and both resident artists on Sheffield's Warp Records, and both of them victims to the again, I'm going to use the word monumentally unhelpful phrase IDM, intelligent dance music. Intelligent dance music is a term a bit like math rock, which has been implanted and imposed, the shadows of which are cast on our enjoyment, our pure bodily resonance with the simple pleasure of music. Intelligent dance music, they said, the critics, riding away, evaporating our personal enjoyment of dance music. Instead of Warp Records being considered to be intelligent, quite rightly, either it was Square Pusher or someone in Ortec, I can't remember, who said, if our music is intelligent, does that mean everything I loved, everything I grew up listening to is somehow stupid? As if Acid House is somehow stupid, as if all of the music dealt with in the book residing on that chair, which I'm going to remove because I want someone to sit on that chair if they want to, feel free. But very much a Lester Bangs of the 21st century, Simon Reynolds, also argues for a pure gut and grit approach to a modern rock and roll, acid house, hardcore, techno, a way of reclaiming musical pleasure for everyone, and also designating experimentation within the lowbrow, within bodily pleasure, not sort of relegated to the sterile environments of the bedroom or the chill-out rooms of a club. So IDM, intelligent dance music, we can play with this phrase and maybe instead of discussing the cerebral, the Apollo, bring it down to the genitalia, bring it down to the Dionysus, bring it down to the gut. IDM, we can keep the acronym, we can keep the letters. Instead of it being intelligent dance music, we'll call it intestinal dance music. Because intestinal dance music, boys and girls, is something I do see a lot, I feel a lot. I feel deep within me. A lot of electronic dance music, a lot of experimentation really deals with maybe that chakra I was talking about earlier, the manipura, the male vagina, the petal or the diamond within the solar plexus, but dealing maybe a little bit lower. I feel a lot of this music's, again I've mentioned Orteca, Square Pusher, Aphex Twins, the gods of so-called IDM, intestinal dance music. But also more recently, I discussed this large lecture, the gentlemen, and it is sadly only men, making music on Lisbon's local label, Rotten Fresh, may they live forever. There's a lot of kind of glitch and little shards of sampling and musical experimentation, which seems to come from somewhere around here. The mystical knowledge, of course, is beyond words. It's very difficult for me to put this into words. But as you may hear after the lecture on this not so professional speaker, there seems to be something distinctly insectoid about stomach-led music, sub-real music. There seems to be something metallic, something which seeps from the body. And seepage, drainage, very much relates to the sub-real. The sub-real is my theory of surrealism, as a new surrealism, a rereading surrealism, as something that is a surrealism designated in bodily knowledge, bodily learning, that we can meditate or take enough drugs to understand or to learn more from the very the acid produced by the body. Again, I'll talk about my friend Elsa. Elsa, someone I've practiced a lot of meditation with, would say, humans are like insects. We produce our own kind of substances. We generate our own kinds of material. And I think it's the body which could be the seat of mysticism, to get away from either over-rationalizing religion and mysticism or being way too pagan New Age about it. It seems to me modern mysticism poses a dual problem nowadays. Either we over-intellectualize faith. We use continental theorists to talk about. We use Levinas, who was impenetrable but worthy. We talk about Derrida, who was impenetrable but worthy. Barthes and so on, impenetrable but worthy. Or we dive into New Age eclecticism. I'm very much on the side of picking and choosing. But the problem with New Age mysticism is that it finds things that are convenient and not useful. When we are dealing with religions we don't like and mysticism we don't like, rather than say it's all bullshit, it's nonsense, it's better to say I don't find it useful, it's not useful to me. And the problem of New Ageism, this birth into the New Age of Aquarius, where humanity is supposedly reaching this crest of future knowledge. The problem is crystals, Hopi, ear candles, all these things are way too convenient. They're not useful. And if we're talking about subreal knowledge, subrealist knowledge, we're talking about a knowledge that happens to ring true whether we like it or not. Whether it seems comfortable is beside the point. It has to have its own truth. So, boys and girls, I think I'm going to move on a few steps before we finish in about 10-15 minutes. I'm going to move on to situating the subreal and situating this kind of chakra within the country, which exists sort of on the southwestern border of Europe. It has a friend of the Atlantic and an enemy of Spain. It's called Portugal. So called because it was the safe harbour of the Romans. Portus Cale apparently probably doesn't mean the safe harbour, the tranquil waters of Porto. Portus Cale is, of course, Portugal. Portugal is a very humid country. Oh, that's lovely, though. That's really nice, Gemma. This doesn't always get to the recordings. I noticed this last week, but I will just repeat what you said. So it's right there on the recording. Is this kind of nostalgia for the saudade, the longing for those who've left? Is, of course, you bring the water vapor from your husband, your partner, your son, your brother. And this is a country very much built on feminine knowledge, unacknowledged feminine knowledge, should we say? Like the majority population in Alfama was female because they weren't allowed on the ships, and that was rare in terms of colonialism that women weren't allowed on the ships. We're going down a different path here, but water vapor, absolutely, as you said over there. Thank you. The houses, it seems like, are springing from this infertile ground. I have tried to put up shelves in a few of my houses. They crumble. The walls are soft. Isn't that interesting? The thing that connects us, the thing that separates us, even the things that separate us are crumbling. And that's the point of water vapor, and that's the point of mold. Mold looks great the first year you're here. It looks really dramatic and kind of rustic. It does look cool. Go to Castelo Branco, the first place I arrived here, jog around and you see this water vapor, you think this is a landlocked in time. And then you run 3 years later and you realise, I'm getting allergies. Allergies, incidentally, and if I'm going to insult your country, I'm going to do it properly. Portugal is a country that doesn't just turn you against the world, it turns you against yourself. Because what black mold presents to you as you lie awake at night at 3 a.m. worrying about the black mold appearing to the right of your shoulder on your wall, as many candles as you burn, as much wiping, there's no help. It's a rot. It's from the core of this country, from the arteries of this God-forsaken place. The mold that appears makes you turn against yourself, because what allergens present to you, what allergens give you, as if it's some kind of demonic gift, they give you lung problems, they give you asthma, or they exacerbate your own asthma, but they make your own body, the own cells of your body react, commit revolution. They give you allergens. I think it's just a delicious lesson that Portugal potentially presents to you. But wait, before I continue insulting this country, I think it's best to turn to another way I can be rude about all of you, which is talking about experimental music, which is definitely my territory. I came here wide-eyed with my little tail, completely bleached from all kind of deeper knowledge of quite how difficult it could be here to make experimental music. The scenes are polluted, boys and girls, with humidity. What do I mean? Well, I'm a noise musician. I'm interested in noise. I'm interested in how all sorts of environmental sounds can be used to make music, right? So I came from England, and England is very much influenced by industrial music and Japanese noise, which is very professional, very sort of how do I put it? Something that requires a lot of process, a lot of apprenticeship to get into, because it's not obvious how you make noise music. So I came here and I thought, all right, let's continue doing this. And I did, and I realized very quickly, ambient sound rules the day here. And why? Well, because symbolically or subconsciously or otherwise, this country is humid in not just an environmental way, but in a kind of audio way. The majority of the noise music I sense here isn't at all noise music. It might pretend to be influenced by it, but it's actually just waves of kind of apathetic clouds of sound. Synthesizers rule supreme here. And it all relates to this kind of complaining, choradinho, as you say, little weeping idea of experimentation here. I know I'm being rude here. I live here because I love Portugal. By the way, let's just keep that in the front of your mind. But I think this kind of ambient music performed by sweaty men on laptops is very much a kind of music which takes itself too seriously. And when you take yourself too seriously, when we forget to laugh, we look at our navels, we call it navel gaze, and we look inwards, we turn inwards, we don't develop, we don't uncurl, as the true definition of development is. And I think that relates also to what I said earlier about the left taking itself too seriously, taking its own virtues too seriously. Virtue signalling is the big crime, in my opinion. This idea of signposting your own piety. The sanctimony of the left is what is our true enemy, and not the obvious kind of people on the other side of the battle, the right. So the noise territory in which we find ourselves today is a kind of chronic laziness, and because of the wetness of the atmosphere, we feel this waves of humid sound, very much divorced from a kind of a Anglo-Saxon, British, proper, forward-thinking dryness in the experimentation you'll find in England. Quite often you'll see people using contact microphones. In the UK, you'll see chains, knives, percussion, a deliberate break in sounds. There's lots of silence. UK noise feels really crisp and dry. So maybe I will leave it at that. And I think
What happened in one of the few concerts you organized here in the really beginning?
Oh God, shit! Don't do it.
Musician decided there was an art piece in the gallery.
And we agreed. Just for the recorder, hello, to say what's going on. I invited in September 2016 a UK noise musician. He's just my mate who makes weird noises. A guy called Pete Can. Bless him, and hello to Pete. He came here, and as you do, you find. I think what you're misunderstanding here is that he sees noise in everything. You see, he doesn't distinguish between high art and low art and leaves and traffic noise and actually situated works of art that should not be disrupted and used for noise performances. He was delicate. So what he did was he dismantled a sculpture. Isn't that beautiful? Wasn't he simply following the ideas of Marinetti and Russolo and destroying the art gallery? No, he was very unconsciously taking elements of the art gallery here and using for his own noise piece. And he couldn't know how much that disrupted with the planning that you put into starting these galleries. Wow. Life is life, and you forgave him. I thought you were going to mention the Nazi thing, the swastikas, but we won't go there. I'm going to tantalise your... Yeah, it was the same night.
We decided not to watch the second.
I feel we're like on the verge of either being in this boring in-joke that only us three are finding interesting, and then on the tantalising, like, curious cliffhanger of, oh, everyone else is like, oh, what's going on? So I'm going to try and address the second thing. The second guys who played here happened to use Nazi insignia during the performance, which in England is actually quite normal. Yeah, who cares? Ha 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 ha. And we all know that's just it's play. You know, it's a pushing of boundaries, and it's a deliberate construction, a deliberately composed way of pushing your morals and your ethics. In Portugal, it's not quite that way, because this country has had.
It's humid
Because it's humid, yeah. Everyone's just sweating. They can't even think of politics here. No, it's not to do with humidity, actually, for once. It's to do with having a father for many, many years. From 1933 to 1968, you had a father and he took care of you. And whether you liked it or not, Antonio de Oliveira Salazar was the... for anyone outside of Portugal listening, was the head of the Portuguese family, so to speak, for so many years, and defined it in his own way, this country. And I think this is what the noise music scene and DIY music scene is very much reacting against. It's a baby throwing the toys out of the pram approach to authoritarianism, because when you try and organise gigs here and when you try and get shit done, often, I'm not talking about here because I've organised gigs outside of here, but people refuse to pay. They don't understand why. They draw on the walls. They piss outside of the urinal, because any form of authority should be rebelled in this country. Whereas in England, we haven't had that quite that experience of paternalistic control.
except Churchill, but that's another story.
Every country self-polices, right? But not to the sustained level of Portugal. So the music scene reflects this very much adolescent approach to power here, contemporary. I mean, we're very much outside of the dictatorship. It's from 1974, just for anyone outside, where Portugal has come into democracy, so-called democracy. But those demons are still with us. That trauma is every day here. The ghosts are with us. So I think in order to cure this problem in one click of the finger is to travel back to rock and roll. I really believe this. I think aesthetics really come back into this. It's not just... If we just talk about politics all night, that's not fun. It's just not fun. It won't sustain a movement. There was the American anarchist whose name I forget. Please tell me if you remember who it is. I don't want a revolution that I can't dance to. Anyone know who that was? It's a great quote. Anyway, some early 20th century American anarchist. And it brings me to Lester Bangs, the ultimate rock critic. He would never tolerate being called a theorist. He was the enemy of intellectualizing art. He was the enemy of any form of music being sophisticated. This man was a devotee of the Stooges. He wrote long love letters to Lou Reed and the Velvet Underground, who are a band we consider to be a little bit more conceptual, but really, they perform like 16 minutes of pure riff, just monotony, which is something that Westerners aren't really good at. Of Pop and Pies and Fun is the wonderfully titled, critique of the Stooges' Funhouse. Of Pop and Pies and Fun, the subtitle of this critique is a program for mass liberation in the form of a Stooges review. How great is that? He's kind of like embedding his revolution within just a mere Stooges review. And I think it's worth just reading a couple of sentences from this. The Stooges' music comes out of an illiterate chaos, gradually taking shape at a uniquely personal style, emerging from a tradition of American music that runs from the woolly rags of backwards string bands up to the magic promise, eternally made and occasionally fulfilled by rock. It's interesting he says occasionally. This is from 1971, the supposed heyday of rock and roll experimentation, the sort of the waking dream, or sort of the early dream of punk rock. Punk rock was definitely a thing that existed before the Sex Pistols, and this is what he's talking about: the Stooges and Iggy Pop. A band can start out bone primitive, untutored, and uncertain, and evolve into a powerful and eloquent ensemble. It happened again and again. The Beatles, the Kinks, Velvets, etc. But the Stooges are probably the first name group to actually form before they knew even how to play. Not put myself on a level of Iggy Pop, okay? I can take my top off. But the point is, I do not know where these lectures are going. And the point is to do these lectures is to create a system and to commit to something politically or intellectually. The Stooges are probably the first name group to actually form before they even knew how to play. This is this is possibly the ultimate rock and roll story, because rock is mainly about beginnings, about youth and uncertainty, and growing through and out of them, and asserting yourself way before you know what the fuck you're doing. Which answers the question raised earlier of what the early Stooges' adolescent mopings had to do with rock and roll. Rock and roll is basically an adolescent music, reflecting the rhythms, concerns and aspirations of a very specialised age group. And I think we should hold tight to the idea of constant development. We should champion and celebrate what rock and roll means, which is adolescence, the eternal adolescent in you. It's not exactly a midlife crisis car dealer saying, I always feel like I'm 22. It's actually this more of a kind of a sense of self-loss. I'm constantly developing. I don't know where I'm going to be. I will always be in that level of uncertainty, but more importantly, of fun, which is what adolescents seem to be best at. So I'm just going to read the previous sentence. Rock is basically an adolescent music reflecting the rhythms, concerns and aspirations of a very specialised age group. It can't grow up. When it does, it turns into something else, which may be just as valid, but it's still very different from the original. So, I feel like I could talk about Lester Bangs all day. But to speed up the end of this lecture, and speeding up is all of what alchemy is. Alchemy is speeding up natural processes. We will eventually deal with the modern day Lester Bangs, Simon Reynolds, who talks about acid, house and hardcore techno. But I thought I'd just mention one or two things that happened during the break. I gave a cup of tea to some of you. I was giving it out. I could sense you a little bit afraid of taking from the moist piece of wood here your cups of tea. So I gave it out. And I deliberately put a pest on one of them. No, I didn't. So, one of you, sorry, your name? Maddie. Maddie received her cup of tea with a tiny little creature on it. This was completely not deliberate. This was accidental. You had a slug on your, like a tiny little baby slug on your, like here, and you said, it's very kind of you. What did you say? You said, is this deliberate? It wasn't on purpose. And then I went into the office or the bar, and Zare said, this is the perfect... He's talking, he's not even paying attention to the lecture right now. But Zare said something like, it seems to have a perfect animal for your lectures. And slugs are totally the right... We don't know where they come from. They're not mammals. They don't seem to lay eggs. If you've ever seen, and you should, when you go on YouTube, slug birth, it's disgusting. It's this generation from the center. The very animal that fucks and eats with the same part of its anatomy is the slug, the snail, and very much that unity of opposites, the hermaphrodite of the animal kingdom, the slug and the snail. So thanks for that, and thanks for you being open to the poison presented to you during the break. And someone else mentioned your name, sorry. Heather mentioned using the sound of shells in her not talk in your performance, I guess. I mean, what would you call it? What did you do last night?
Anti-artist talk. Where is it? Sure. Yeah.
It was an artist talk, right? You seem to perform a little bit.
Anti-artist talk.
Sorry, I didn't hear the first bit. Anti-artist talk. Very much like the sequel, cycle or the continuation of non-DJs that this venue itself presents, inviting people to come and dissolve the hierarchy of the priest-like DJ that, sorry Portugal, I love you, but you love DJs, and that's problematic. It can be quite problematic. There's this whole non-verbal cult of the DJ, the technique involved in putting someone on a platform, not being able to see what they're doing, and it all being about this kind of school of unspoken taste that we dispose in the DJ's hands, this taste curation. Well, Zaratan does the opposite. Zaratan is trying to cut the legs of those hipster bastard DJs and let DJs, allow them, giving them the, not literally the floor, to sit on the cold stone and give DJing performance. It's not even a performance, it's just sort of putting music on in the background. That's so important, that this is a kind of thing which comes through the subconscious. So, and again, in the argument for ambient music, I do like ambient music, it's the kind of acoustic wallpaper of the musical world. You sort of, it should be ignorable. And the now DJ, no one's coming here and like taking MDMA and like partying. It's very much like you come here for a chat, you go for a beer, and if you like the music, you talk to the DJ. There's no barriers, no separation, apart from the potentially endless complications resulting from the mold and the sexually transmitted diseases presented by Zaratan. But we'll go away from that and just broach onto, I've forgotten your name, Heather's scraping of shells. What a beautiful idea. I was wondering how I could present the sub-real, the aesthetic of this in a kind of practical sense. I was thinking I could burn beautiful leaves that I took from the Azores and show you it. But in the wind, it's going to be really difficult. But you've given me something that I could jump onto next. So to finish today, I mentioned the modern Leicester bangs and maybe a music which feels maybe a bit more relevant to us nowadays. It might be false to call this music artificial or digital or somehow divorced from nature, because the thing that puts a string on a guitar is technology, and technology is always with us. But I'll talk a little bit about a book, or quote from a book called Energy Flash by Simon Reynolds, a journey through rave music and dance culture. This is a chronicle of early 90s, late 80s dance music by a British writer called Simon Reynolds. And in the introduction, he says how much he would like to write a book twice the size, and undoubtedly I've been speaking for much longer than you expected. That's the whole thing about passion. It just sort of seeps through, and love just seems to pour out with no idea of direction at all. But he has a publisher, and he said it would probably be twice the size, but it would be half the book. What makes Energy Flash, the name of this book, What makes Energy Flash work is the partisan zeal burning through it. What makes Energy Flash work is the partisan zeal through it. The unbalanced ardour for one particular sector of electronic dance culture, hardcore, rave, and all it spawned. And what he's saying is, for me, this kind of maybe ironic detachment from what he really loves. He's arguing that his very love for this particular kind of electronic music is what gives it the power. Instead of him trying to do this kind of respectful, pluralistic, democratic covering of many kinds of dance music, no, he's saying, no, this is I love this kind of dance music, I hate that kind of dance music, and I'm going to do my best to become a kind of embedded reporter from it. So he reports from the dance floors while being a distant observer from the dance floor. It's a really difficult position to get. This is what makes the book an authentic testament to obsession and belief. And if you think about it, that's how all true music fandom manifests. In the abstract, I'm patriotic for dance culture as a whole. Patriotic is a word we're not supposed to adopt, but I think we should nowadays adopt something in the postmodern horizon, the desert mess left us by the French theorists, and from the dissolving of right and left political persuasions. I think we should be patriotic, ironically so, to some leaning. Some commitment is demanded of us. I'm patriotic for dance culture as a whole. I'm on its side, every last bit of it. But in practice, there's certain zones that I really feel passionate about, and that's how it is with rock fans and hip hop fans too. The next lecture will be about urination, and the last lecture will be about light laughter, a form of bodily secretion that you could talk all day about. Anal alchemy or shitting, defecation. These are all forms of bodily knowledge. These are all ways of getting in touch with something that our ancestors were very used to contacting, which we're not so good at nowadays. Modern technology, social media has divorced us from concentration and from commitment. And later 3 and 4, that's what we'll deal with. I will shut up. I won't deal with any more science. I won't deal with any more questions. I'll invite you all to come and contribute to the theory. And thank you very much all on this cold Saturday evening. Thank you all for your attention. Thanks to the gentlemen. Obrigado. For today's lecture, which incidentally is all about pee, urine luck. I thought that was right. One pun for the lecture today. It's going to be comparatively short. Oh my God, only 45 minutes. God, because we've got Heather Lyons' inauguration, right here at 7. Okay, you look strangely unexcited, Heather. Okay. Anyway, I'm excited. So I was preparing for today's lecture, and in my moist, humid, very Portuguese house built in 1957, and I went to the toilet to conduct further research on urine, and I was not completing the business. I hadn't even started the task. I was busy looking at the bus timetable to get to Zaratan, and I heard a creaking above my head, a noise, a little crackle, a little noise of something happening, and then I had to go. Trousers up, jumped out of the bathroom, and as I can show you the photos, the roof collapsed quite literally on top of me. I had dust in my nose, and what brilliant metaphor to start with today's piss superstition. Superstition, as I had just looked up, the history of this word is to be above standing. No one really knows quite how above standing turns into our modern idea of pursuing irrational, mythical ideas of religion, as superstition is, or of fate or fortune. But that's the original meaning. Super and ste is kind of superstition, and it's an interesting relation with the word substance, which is literally the opposite, quite the opposite. Understand is the substance, and superstition is the opposite. I've explained it really, really badly, but I thought it was interesting that of all days, this is what happens. And Zé of Zaratan told me that, well, you're like the people of Brittany. They believed the sky would collapse on top of them. So as hopefully these lectures might be a sense of inverting ideas or collapsing structures or deconstruction, I'll move on to what I think the piss superstition is. The piss superstition is a mystical joke, quite like in November 1997 when Duchamp's fountain, the urinal, sells for $17 million. Or is it 1.7 million? But it was a lot of dollars, something like $17 million. God bless Sotheby's for elevating a joke originally. In my opinion, Duchamp's urinal was always a joke, always poking fun at the art world, and yet the joke is kind of on Duchamp as the money's not going to him. And I would like to bring us all into the room, into the space, into this necessary transitional part of the Zaratan complex, the courtyard, the open space, a clean space of diverging nutrients and minerals. We are very much in the kidneys of Lisbon, in a sense that we're here not to just listen to my stupid stories or ideas, but also to sort of process what we've sort of pumped through our heads before, and then eventually to enjoy the taste of our own ideas, the savouring, the aroma of our own sort of ideas, and so to speak, abstract urine. So I'm eventually going to propose that we drink each other's urine, but I'll tell you how we're going to get there a bit later. to start today, I think we'll just make a little note for the god of these lectures, the hero from the 1940s, 50s Paris, our friend Georges Bataille. Georges Bataille is sitting over there. He's actually got his own camera today, which is a nice little tribute. He helps build this idea of what he called base materialism. I'd like to call it instead maybe the sub-real. So Bataille, base materialism or sub-realism, basically the idea of getting the lower parts, the depths of ourselves, and elevating them into a kind of new mysticism, or maybe a very, very old mysticism which we've lost, forgotten, and we're going to recover. So the ideas of Bataille and of these lectures are very much historical. Excellent. Good job. So Bataille wrote two things which we're going to talk about today. First of all is the Pineal Eye essay, and the second is an unpublished book called Absence of Myth. I think actually, given we're lacking a little bit of time, I think we will just skip over one or two of the quotes and just focus on the idea of urine, or potentially urine, but any kind of emerging of fluid from a man's penis, or a penis, I should say. The intolerable cry of cocks. That's a great idea for ejaculation or urination. The intolerable cry of cocks. The idea that this kind of relief or ecstasy of dejecta is somehow intolerable, pleasure being somehow impossible to perceive. The intolerable cry of cocks has a solar significance because of the pride and feeling of triumph of the man perceiving his own dejecta under the open sky. What bigger pleasure is there than pissing in the wind, of flooding the fields with your own urine, connecting your nitrogen to that of the world? You're somehow part of the universe, and in a sense drinking your own urine. You're this own Ouroboros, connecting yourselves to the minerals. Your minerals are that of the earth, and the earth is yours. Possibly. In the same way, during the night, an immense troubled love, sweet as a young girl's spasm, abandons and throws itself into a giant universe with the intimate feeling of having urinated the stars. That's from the Pineal Eye, from Visions of Excess, which is here, which you should definitely have a look at later on. And very quickly moving on to an essay of his called The Absence of Myth. And the Absence of God, I should say. The collection is called Absence of Myth. This is where we're going to really focus on today, in the political ramifications of pissing and drinking our own urine. So, the absence of God is no longer a closure. It is the opening up to the infinite. The absence of God is greater and more divine than God. So, potentially the idea is that monks, mystics, nuns are more atheistic than so-called common people, or people outside of the monasteries and convents. Why could you suggest that a monk and a nun is more of an atheist than, say, an everyday person? Potentially because they've thought for longer what exactly a kind of God they're worshipping, rejecting most of the common ideas of what God is, and then embracing a even potentially more nihilistic and threadbare or sort of bare God, minimal God. The absence of God is no longer a closure, it is the opening up to the infinite. So atheism in itself is a release into this greater idea of mysticism. The absence of God is greater and more divine than God. And so the idea is that to free ourselves from what God means, we would have to return to our baseness, the disgust of everyday life, the smell of our own steaming urine. So to move on quickly, we'll deal with a sort of poet of piss in many ways, the Irish writer, of course, James Joyce, whose Ulysses mentions piss, I think contains the word piss about 7 times. Admittedly, it's quite a big book. But he seems to elevate piss into its own, possibly a fetish, which implies maybe a kind of a minimal valuing of something, but I think it's something a little bit more than this. From Ulysses, I can't tell you which chapter, James Joyce talks or writes of the smells of men, spat on sawdust, sweetish, warmish cigarette smoke, the reek of plugs, spilt beer, men's beery piss, the smell the stale of ferment. The idea that urine is a kind of mineral-rich fluid full of potential. That brings me a little bit closer to the modern trend, with which reportedly 3 million Chinese people are doing regularly, which is drinking their own urine. Why they do this is quite curious. I don't literally suggest we drink our own ferment, the stale, beery piss, as James Joyce says, but it's interesting what draws people to doing this thing. In one other moment in Ulysses, Joyce writes that a woman bent forward, her feet apart, pisses cowily. It's not a word, really, in English. To make an adverb from cow, the woman is pissing as a cow, cowily. I thought it was very, very beautiful. And in, I think, one of the early chapters, classic scene where Leopold Bloom, the hero of Ulysses, is preparing breakfast. Mr. Leopold Bloom ate with relish the inner organs of beasts and fowls. He liked thick giblet soup, nutty gizzards, a stuffed roast heart, liver slices fried with crust crumbs, fried hencods roes. Most of all, he liked grilled mutton kidneys, which gave to his palate a fine tang of faintly scented urine. So, why am I myself fetishizing piss, urine? Well, for a couple of reasons. Number one, it brings us down to earth. It brings a little bit of humility to a scenario of which we're in, which is quite typically associated with either the academe, universities, not known to be the most humble of places, or even places like seminars, seminaries as well, where monks are trained. Seminars, of course, where you go and talk, which, incidentally, seminars comes from the word semen, seed. Interesting. And it leads me to the problem of what the lack of words for what this thing is. I haven't had so much interaction, or little interaction today, but I'm determined to make these lectures into something else that isn't quite a lecture, more of a reading group, more of a sharing of ideas. Whenever you look up words for a public speech, you're either driven towards the university language, so seminars, lectures, readings, or you're led to religious terminology, sermons, and so on. So we could maybe invent a new word. I would love this to be, and I mean this in all seriousness, and kind of an orgy. And I mean that maybe if we can try to get that word orgy and clean it a little bit, because of course we think of sexual group sex basically, but an orgy really comes from the word work. I can't tell you which old Greek word it is, but orgy in the sense that this is a kind of a laboratory working together, us sort of generating the kidneys, as it were, a new fluid, a new substance for spiritual enlightenment. So we will have a break in a few minutes where I will encourage you all to, yes, of course, use the toilet, having your own moment of reflection privately, and I will encourage you to do that as Isabel, in fact, reveals what's going on. So, Isabel, if you can do me a favour and kindly reveal the hidden gift, encouraging for our own fluidity. We are, above all, afraid of dryness, and that's why a little bit in for you. We're going to drink some perfect tea that I made. It's a wonderful little substance. It's my own chai, and please help yourselves. I'm leaving it there. Don't be shy. Come and collect a little bit of tea. And we'll have a very quick break of just about 3-4 minutes to find our own seclusion in the house of the bath, Casa de Baño, or the toilet. In fact, I think there's a poster still in the toilet now. I can't recall it word for word. Go and find it for yourself. It's quite beautiful. And it's all about this solitude of your own warmth and your own fluids and your own dark room, so to speak. And then we'll return to our ecstatic orgy in about 5 minutes. Thanks, boys and girls. So, sometimes, with all these nights, sometimes I just go to the bathroom to breathe. if you go to the toilet, which you should do, it's great there, and the roof doesn't collapse, amazingly. There's a poster there. Does anyone can
It's from Samuel Walsh, an amazing New Zealand artist, and the roof will not collapse because it's a fake roof.
Oh, it is, right? Just like that's
Yeah.
that one as well.
The two things. You can see here. This is the roof. This is the in-between space. It's a new fake roof.
Oh, so it's a fake roof.
It will not fall down.
Okay.
It's already had fallen.
I mean, it's one thing for the earth to quake, but for something above you, that's really quite horrible. Yeah. Anyway, there is more tea. Please indulge. I will leave it here. In fact, I'll leave it over here because I know what you're like. You got it. Don't be shy. There's my tea. So with all these nights, sometimes I just go to the bathroom to breathe, a place of rest. In fact, what is it that we're breathing? What is it that we're sniffing? This glorious magical substance, our own urine, which understandably humans either love or hate depending on time and place. I'll bring you to 17th century England, and an author who wrote about urine being so highly valued by fullers. Fullers were people who processed wool, so that to make wool clean and organise the minuscule threads of wool. Wool, incidentally, being the material, the currency of our Britain's Industrial Revolution, and what fed the engines of the Industrial Revolution. I'm overstating this, but it was urine. It really was urine. From a delightfully titled book by Sally Magnuson called The Life of Pee, the story of how urine got everywhere. I'm going to read to you about urine and value, because in 17th and 18th century England, it was the urine of Methodists, of particular Christians who didn't drink, that was really, really highly valued, because their urine was less acidic than the rest of the highly intoxicated Brits. It certainly paid to be a Methodist in parts of rural Wales. Not only was heaven within your grasp, so was a premium rate income from your pee. The man running the local fulling mill, or pandy in Welsh, needed large quantities of urine to clean the cloth sent there by local weavers. So he brought it in, driving his horse and cart around the houses of his regular customers every day, collecting their pails or their barrels of household urine, emptying them into a cask on the wagon and handling over payment. Compare this remarkable series where the abstemious, non-drinking Methodist urine was acquired and even paid for by the fullers, by the people who processed wool, to contemporary Germany, where if you go and stay or couch surf or whatever, you may see a poster by the toilet saying Sitzpinkeln. I don't know if anyone's seen this or experienced the peculiarities of urinating in Germany, but there's been a big movement, I think from the early 2000s, I'm not sure. Sitzpinkeln, it literally means sit peeing, sitting while you pee, and it's applied to, of course, understandably, to men. Women we don't need to worry about there, but the idea that men should be sitting down while they go to the toilet, while they piss, is a way of reclaiming some certain dignities for cleaners. Cleaners predominantly in Germany are women, and why should they have to scrub the waste, the dejecta of their husbands and brothers and sons and employers? So that was an interesting moment where we have two variations on how urine could be valued. I'm valuing urine in only a symbolic way, you'll be glad to know. But why? What brings 3 million Chinese people to drink their own urine regularly? It's to do potentially with something I find quite hard to understand. Maybe after lectures it will make more sense if we just talk together. But it's to do with the fact that urine isn't simply a process of a direct process of the beginning of the gastrointestinal tract is here, the donut, so to speak, going all down. It doesn't go straight to the kidneys and out. It's a different process. It goes as I understand it, from the stomach to the large intestine into the blood. So water is absorbed in the large intestine into blood, and the blood goes through the liver and then through the kidneys. Urine is actually a secondary waste disposal mechanism. Okay, so there's this idea that urine is kind of privileged. It's not just waste. Blood passes through the liver, where toxins, dead cells, various waste products are removed and eliminated, then pumped through the kidneys, where excess fluids, nitrogen, vitamins, minerals, proteins are extracted and transferred to the bladder. So here's the resting point of the bladder. The bladder contains, according to people who do drink their own urine, auto-urine therapy it's called, oh my God. The idea is that the body just rejects what it doesn't need for the moment, but it still has some vital minerals, cancer-curing minerals, according to some, like Martha Christie, author of, this is delightful, Your Own Perfect Medicine. It's great. She claims that drinking urine cured her of a host of medical problems, and she even states that doctors have deliberately not highlighted the benefits of auto-urine therapy because there are no profits in it for them. Absolutely exquisite conspiracy theories there. But I think we can find a middle point between kind of new agey, dubious therapies, maybe a cry for help in a world where we feel so lost we turn to our own urine in a sort of feeling of self-empowerment, as embarrassing as that seems. We move on, I would say, to a higher elevation, brought to us, you could say, by a prayer, which is said by Orthodox Jews when they go to the toilet. This prayer, I believe, comes from the Talmud, and there are various translations. I'll just read one of them. Blessed is God. This is a prayer that many Orthodox Jews would say after relieving themselves, after pointing Percy at the porcelain, after spending a penny, as my mum would say, spending a penny. Beautiful euphemisms. Blessed is God, who has formed the human body in wisdom and created many orifices and cavities. It is obvious and known before you, that you with a capital Y indicating God, it is obvious and known before you that if one of them were to be opened or closed incorrectly, it would be impossible to survive and stand before you at all. Blessed is God who heals all flesh and does wonders. A crucial part, I believe, and what was made very emphatic to me by a rabbi I used to know. He said to me, we're thanking God because we are open, fleshy beings, and we sometimes close. We are essentially donuts. If you look, not just at mine, but consider your own gastrointestinal tract, it starts here. Digestion, in a sense, starts here, so to speak. Your saliva contains chemicals to process food already, and it ends, of course, down there. And it's thanks to, according to the Talmud, the beautiful phenomenon of the human sphincter. The sphincter is a kind of a philosophical ideal. It can shut when it needs, it opens when it needs to. The problems of childbirth, particularly human problem, are arguably a problem of fear caused by the male-dominated medical industry, who are the stars of the show in childbirth. The women is secondary. The doctor comes in and saves everything and cures, and it's all sterile. Where in fact, of course, it's the women's need who comes first. Why we should stop the women being horizontal and make them vertical when they give birth, and also to relax the sphincter, the vaginal sphincter. The vaginal sphincter contains muscles which are incredibly flexible, beyond anything that man or humans can make. And it's known that when women have helpers when they give birth, that they relax, the vaginal tissue releases, and it's a less painful, less problematic birth. So we can thank God that we can actually release when we need and clothes when we need. This is problematic, of course, in two senses when we are presented with fear. Fear is a curious element in the urinary process. Speaking as a man, yes, sometimes it is difficult to go in public. There's some really funny names which we call this in Britain. Stage fright. Bladder shame, but the idea if you're surrounded with a group of other people, it's really difficult to go even though you really need to go. So clearly the body rules the day in this sense, but fear does the opposite. We know that we have phrases, of course. I was so scared I peed myself, and this genuinely happens. People, it's to do, as I understand it, with overridings in the brain of, I'm not sure, the limbic system and this or that. But the idea is the fear locks down processes and releases others in your brain, and people, of course, piss themselves. So there's a lot of British slang as well to do with pissing and urine and fear and so on. So, by the way, more tea over there. If you're thirsty, please do help yourself. Mm-hmm. So, good to see you as well. Hello. So I'm going to bring it to the symbolic level, which is where I think we need to rest on the idea. I feel, as Bataille wrote about the absence of myth, and our own absence of myth in terms of our reluctance to talk about spirituality, and the fact that word myth itself is often used as a pejorative word, as a negative term. Myth is something that we can reclaim. I'm going to presume most of us are on the left side of things, on the left wing. Myth is something I think we can talk about in political terms and transform it into a kind of things that we all can leak readily around the city, feeding the ecosystem with our own sort of radical solutions to political problems at the moment. And so myth is the urine, myth is the substance, and we can all drink our own myths and spread it around the globe. What do I mean? What am I actually trying to say, though? Well, I'll bring it back to the idea that myth is something that maybe we've forgotten in our Enlightenment and rationalist life, and in fact something that populists and the right wing are really, really good at using. I'm going to, again, this is a really quotey lecture today, but I'm going to quote from a writer called James Meek, who wrote a book called Dreams of Leaving and Remaining, which is about Brexit. It came out last year, and he claims that the right have stolen myth and actually have been the better ones at using myth, are not hesitant to use stories in generating political energy. So I quote, "The wealthiest and most powerful in Europe, Australasia and North America have turned the myth to their advantage." What myth is he talking about? He's talking about the myth of St. George, as well as the myth of Robin Hood. More importantly, Robin Hood stealing from the rich and giving to the poor. And he's saying they've inverted it. In this version of Robin Hood, the traditional poor, the unemployed, the disabled, refugees have been put into the conceptual box where the rich used to be. It is they, the social category previously labelled poor, who are accused of living in big houses, wallowing in luxury and not needing to work. While those previously considered rich are redesigned as the ones, or redescribed, I think, as the ones who work terribly hard for fair reward or less, forced to support this new category of poor who are considered rich. In this version, the Sheriff of Nottingham runs a ruthless realm of plunder and political correctness, ransacking the homesteads of honest peasants for money to finance the conceptual rich. That is the unemployed. The conceptual rich now are the unemployed, the disabled, refugees, working class single mothers, dodgers, scroungers, chavs, chiselers, and cheats. In this version of the myth, Robin Hood is a tax cutter and a handout denouncer. He's a Jacob Rees-Mogg. He's a Nigel Farage. He's a Margaret Thatcher and a Ronald Reagan. He's winning elections. The left need to be unafraid of swallowing their own dejector and spraying it around like hungry dogs around our own political territories. I'll just rest again and generate my own for 1 second. And I have sort of, we've only got 10 minutes left, but I have quite quickly forgotten one of the important things that sort of brings these lectures together is the idea of inner alchemy. Alchemists have used urine over the years to generate gold, the philosopher's stone, but much more symbolically, the idea is that God is us and rests within us. Christian Hermeticism manages to combine Jesus as a symbolic figure, and also the fact that we can all be a part of him and his heaven on earth. So, in terms of like a Vedic idea or a more Eastern interpretation of urine and inner alchemy, we come to the lower chakra of the Muladhara. I think I'm pronouncing that okay. Muladhara is the chakra which rests in the pelvic floor. Pelvic floor rests between, say, like the vagina and the anus, or for men, of course, the testicles and the anus. So it's lower than low. It's quite hard to locate, especially for men. As I said in a previous lecture, I am a Pilates teacher, and the pelvic floor is really important for many sort of physical activities. And I found the pelvic floor, this lowest part, this bottom chakra, to be really useful in getting my clients to calm down. It's really hard to release your shoulders. It's always a problem in with upper back pain. It's really, really hard to actually know how to release from above, because you feel all this responsibility. So when you actually connect the lowest part of the torso, the other end of the oblong or the box, it's actually, in my experience, much easier to get clients engaged in unlearning bad posture. So the Muladhara, or the pelvic floor chakra, is often associated with worry. Again, why it's so difficult for me to help clients release from here. And shame. So what I often ask people to do, especially for men, it's much harder with men to do this. You say, imagine your team is about to score a goal. Or imagine you're stepping into an ice bath, and then you kind of zip up and you manage to engage the rest of your body really fluidly. And when you really connect from the bottom chakra or the lowest chakra, what's called the root chakra, Muladhara, you may feel an enormous distance relating from your ears or say your shoulders to the body. In meditation, it's a task to deconstruct the body and reassemble it, and then you start to feel how enormous your own body is. And that brings me to the chakra in general, the wheels, the energy circles of the body. Chakra means wheels, and to the energy point, which helps us connect to the top. And the idea of using our fluids to connect to ourselves. The Ouroboros myth, the idea of a snake eating its own tail, is the idea potentially of not just sucking your own cock, of course. Quite literally is the idea. The mouth is the womb and the tail is the cock. Possible for women as well, all right? If we're attaining spiritual enlightenment, I'm becoming a woman, and a woman is becoming a man, and we're having that ultimate sort of intimate relationship with gender. But it's the idea of marrying the low with the high. The Ouroboros, I think, is a beautiful myth, so to continue this idea of self-generation. The alchemical idea that energy doesn't come from nothing, it's energy generates itself. The strange thing about energy is that the more you lose, the more you get, it seems. So the horrible situation of chronic fatigue syndrome is where you don't have enough energy to create energy. And when you do have energy, you go for a jog, you find you have more energy. It's quite a perverse idea. And you sort of need less sleep, so to speak. The Ouroboros is described by the alchemical thinker, or the philosopher of alchemy, Aaron Cheek, as the origin that is ever present. The alchemical idea as well that our origins don't have a start. It's always within us. We're always able to drag heaven down from us, a bit like the roofs when we're pissing. It is not a beginning, since all beginning is linked with time. And the present is not just the now, today, the moment or a unit of time. It is ever originating, an achievement of full integration and continuous renewal. Anyone able to concretize, to realize the effect and reality of origin and the present in entirety, supersedes his beginning and end and the mere here and now. I hope this doesn't sound too abstract, because I always like to bring this down to drinking your own piss. But I think this glorious golden substance has been valued over and over again, not by people who want to clean wool in the early industrial revolution in England, but by many people wanting to seek their own spiritual enlightenment. There is mineral, there are nutrients within what we might usually consider the lowest of the low. And I think the lowbrow, pornography, noise music, wrestling, skateboarding, graffiti. Actually, I fucking hate graffiti. But you get my point. All of this can be elevated. It's the idea of anti-art, breaking, dissolving with our own acidic urine, the old constructs of art and art making. So, to finish today, I'll just bring it back. I can't seem to stop quoting people. Maybe that's the idea of spraying around and splashing into all, being a very sort of horizontal way of thinking. Carl Jung. We haven't explicitly mentioned him yet. Carl Jung, man and his symbols, the champion of the collective unconscious. I'm going to link dreams with myth here, because I think it's very much related in terms of urine and drinking it. He said, and quoting Carl Jung, the Talmud says the dream is its own interpretation. That's brilliant. Inbuilt within myth is its own sort of digestion and its own kind of filtration and evangelizing it as well. If there's one thing the left, and one thing that radical Christians and mystics can do nowadays is reclaim evangelism, not from this dogmatic, homophobic, and so on association we've had recently. But just like the word orgy we had earlier, orgy really means to work together, working together. We can reinterpret this idea of urine as containing its own goodness. The dream is its own interpretation, boys and girls. So, sitting or standing, ladies and gentlemen, whether we're in Germany or not, why don't we enjoy ourselves a nice collective urination later on over there. Do make sure you have a look at the poster, and I will finish very shortly. We've got Heather Lyon's inauguration coming up, and which is all very exciting. Then 2 concerts, and come and talk to me and enjoy the tea over there. Thank you very much, boys and girls.
Thank you.
5, 4.
Welcome, boys and girls. Assquake, bake brownies, drop the kids off at the pool, bump a grumpy, bust a grumpy, burn a mule, build a log cabin, bury a Quaker, lay a cable, ride the porcelain bus are all variously connected words, synthesized, spewed out. Push brown, push out a grumpy, release a chocolate hostage, squeeze a steamer, squeeze out a Cleveland steamer, take a chat, take a crap, spend a penny, take a dookie, take the Browns to the Super Bowl, upper decker, visit Uncle Grumpy, throw the juice are some ways of expressing going to do a number 2. And what are we doing today in the cold city of Lisbon? We are here sitting in the cold, transmitting our ideas, if not diseases, and we're all here to shoot the shit. So thanks very much for coming to the last lecture here today, last in season of 4 on inner alchemy and the subreal. I would also like to thank Zé and Gemma for their enthusiasm and help and creativity, which is something I didn't. You're creative people. I didn't expect you to quite fill these lectures with so much inspiration as well. The posters are terrific, and I want to take one of them home, so please let me do that. So the last of all, our lectures is about, I think, the gleaming alchemical gold, which is the process of passing a brownie, so to speak, laying a pipeline, lay a hot snake, make a poopy, park a custard, pinch a loaf, punch a duke, rock a juice, see a man about a dog, send a fax, shit the bed. It's clear to me shit inspires so many phrases, so much swearing, and so many different ways of applying negative words for positive things. But first off, we will start out with a very important health warning. If you happen to need bog roll, papel higiénico, toilet roll, do ask there at the counter before you go. I'm just concerned about you all. So that's been the first 3 lectures. We talked about laughing, crying, and urination. But the real gold lies in the nigredo. Nigredo being the first part of the alchemical process. Nigredo is the lowest of low substances, the mud, the shit, the earth that you use to process and eventually turn into gold. Of course, that could have been literal for the alchemists of ancient China, the Taoist alchemists, but applying this also to the perhaps pre-Enlightenment alchemists of medieval Europe, this was the same thing, the idea of using the low in order to get it to the high. So with my idea of sub-realism, the idea is to go down, explore the depths of oneself in order to find a different level of transcendence, a new variety of transcendence. So how you do that, I haven't been so explicit over the lectures how you might go about finding such transcendence, but I think it is connected to forgetting the visual and removing ourselves from the written word, hence being here, present, sharing each other's physical energy, the rubbing we have together in a sort of lecture situation. And for this reason I've made a lot of recordings and I put them on appropriately titled YouTube, so intestinally speaking we might be able to process or even analyse these ideas. And to take the first 4 letters of that word, analyse, why don't we hit the first proper thing of the lecture, which is of course analysis. Analysis. It's a beautiful word, and I think that's what the body is effectively doing when it processes food after it leaves the stomach and enters the small intestine. Food is analysed, but analysis is well defined if we look at the opposite. Synthesis is to combine elements together, process and simplify, whereas analysis is sort of pretty much the opposite. It's a breaking up or a loosening, a releasing. It comes from the original word analien, which means to set free, to unweave. To even loose a ship from the moorings or its moorings, to unloose something. Ana means up or throughout, and the longest organ, I guess, of the body, if we forget the skin, is the large intestine. And so ana, the analysis in ana, is quite an important part. Also bears a kind of oral pun on anal as well, although the word origins are different. Incidentally, the ring anel in Portuguese comes from the idea of ring, and so ring finger and anel have a sort of similar history. And then there's lysis, which of course means a loosening. So it's a throughout loosening, analysis. But really I like to think of this idea as unweaving. As psychiatric analysis could be thought of as a kind of unweaving of complex ideas. The one curious approach to therapy that I really think is very helpful in maybe in an alchemical sense or a mystical sense is the idea of loosening knots. So psychiatric trauma, it could be considered as a bundle of knots and tangled webs, only to be unravelled only if the client, the subject, is willing to let go, perhaps let go of held trauma. To use a more typically mystical word, samskara means the same thing. Samskara, I believe, literally means emotional scarring, but also could be considered as a tangling.
Where it is.
You do. Thank you, Gemma. Please.
I don't know where it is.
Oh, samskara. Samskara.
Can you read the subtitles?
So I should be quite explicit because I'm talking about not exactly literal meaning. I'm talking about etymological meaning. So let's go to the literal meaning right now, as it is samskara. I do definitely need to look at this, but it is understood as emotional scarring. So it's a Sanskrit word, basically a replacement for the word trauma. Trauma really gives the idea of incision or cutting. So you literally say physical trauma for a car accident, for example. Whereas samskara, I think, is more helpful because the implication is more. Well, this is my interpretation. More about a collection of knots and tangles in your psyche and your emotions. Well, I think a big part of inner alchemy, the surrealism, is to explore etymological history of words, to explore what you could imagine is the subconscious of language, of used language. More importantly, language that is used every day. So etymology, I think, really lifts up the ghosts from the ground and explains a lot of culture today. So we can't quite lose our etymological past. We can't lose our medieval past. I'm going a bit of a diversion here. What I mean is, for example, we like to think of ourselves as post-enlightenment, rational beings full of science, technology, and social media. We're very proud of this. This is what really bothers me. We neglect our historical past and our mystical pasts because we've completely forgotten how to use our other senses. So, for example, you sneeze in Portugal, you are given a little saint, Santinho, involving some form of blessing or the other. You do it in England, someone will bless you. And no one is really thinking of sending an angel or really interceding in the entering of a devil in your body. But still, that history, when we finish today's lecture, I will tell you for God to be with you. God be with you. Goodbye. To God. Adeus. So I'm very curious about etymology, and I think it's a way of us shedding our skins and attaining this forgotten memory of mysticism or contact with transcendence. Another side note to a side note already made, but I believe as more I keep doing these lectures that we're not humans. We're actually, after all, we're insects. First of all, we shed or we exfoliate a lot of our cultural knowledge and we deconstruct. We're talking about Bataille, who's just sitting for us over there, Georges Bataille. If we're talking about the French theorists, they'll say deconstruct, which itself swallows its own rejection of Enlightenment theory, the idea of taking apart and, again, analysing, loosening up ideas. Deconstruct feels very artificial and, in fact, bizarrely quite German, the idea of uncombining, so to speak. So I really like the idea of exfoliating our cultural ideas, shedding off and metamorphosing. That's the idea that we're becoming who we already were, and exploring the invisible truth that was already in front of us right at the beginning. We're also insect-like, to steal an idea from my friend Elsa Coimbra, who said, yes, humans really are quite like insects because they ooze their own substances. And I think she was talking about non-physical substances that would have been very clear to our ancestors, especially those who would have discussed chakras. But a lot of these lectures have been curious about what the body leaves behind, excretes without knowing or without deliberation. It's curious that I've looked at urination, I've looked at laughter as its own kind of non-physical substance. Crying, of course, does have its own sort of salty tears involved. But I haven't looked at pus, I haven't looked at ejaculate or semen, I haven't looked at vaginal fluids. Swearing as well. It's kind of sweating. The list goes on. It's curious as soon as you start. The obvious would be shitting and pissing, right? But there's so many more layers to this, which I hope to pick up on when we start the reading circle, which will start in only a few days' time. So that's the first part. We've done that. Let's shelve that. Analysis, I think, leading on is not just curious in terms of what it means, what the body does, but it's an incredible process. What a body is able to do to the stuff we put inside it, chewing gum, bits of foil. It will, regardless, take it and do its best, not just to reject, but also to analyze itself, to take the best of the substance that we force into it. Urination was really, for me, interesting because it wasn't a simple process of fluid goes to the kidneys. It was blood is processed through the kidneys and then urine is released. So that wasn't a straightforward process, and the body would just take what it needs, so it would release nutrients anyway that it doesn't need. But the process of the processes of the gastrointestinal tract are beautiful in a very sort of engineering sense. The fecal matter is passed through chains and chains, I don't know how many meters, but it's very, very long indeed, of the small and large intestines. And the idea is it squeezes the most it possibly can out of any matter that we shove through our lips. And it's nice to consider the gastrointestinal tract, as I'm all sure you're aware, yes, lying at home at night, yes, it's nice to think of the gastrointestinal tract as starting with the lips. It begins here. Freud's curiosity with the lips might stem a little bit from this sort of speaking digestion, or this digestion that begins right in the mouth, because we produce, again, we're insects in a sense, produce these chemicals right in the mouth that begin the digestion process. Saliva contains chemicals that begin to break down food as it slips down, like sort of the way a snake moves down into the stomach, waiting for its inevitable analysis. So if we begin to appreciate these processes, we come to, I think, a sense of wonder. The false opposition of science and religion is easily sort of knocked for six. When you just talk to scientists or people who study and research, they have a sense of wonder and awe about the world that you often don't see in professed atheists or even religious people, so-called religious people. Scientists should be the first to say how beautiful the construction of the body is as a machine, as a mechanism. And I would like to perhaps define wonder as the first step for religious processes, the first step of spiritual attachment. It is wonder of the world that is in a sense a kind of spiritual attachment. Before I go on to this possibly not very interesting side of the lecture, I don't for a second want to monopolize any form of thinking about the world as it inevitably being spiritual. I'm perfectly accepting of an atheist who has a sense of wonder and awe about the world. But just as a shorthand, I'm going to say mystical and spiritual and possibly religious as well. But I think gratitude is the next step. You have wonder and then you have gratitude. You are grateful for what you've been given. Again, a religious imposition in language is to say grateful for what you've been given. What do you mean been given? By whom? Who's given you what? I think deep down a lot of us feel it's absurd to be inhabiting a body. We weren't asked for it. Given by whom? It's simply an inherited metaphor in language to say you've been given a body. But gratitude is a religious impulse. It starts from this. And I find a deep psychic and spiritual and philosophical vacuity in modern life by people who want something more, people who assume that this life is somehow disappointing, who assume everything that has been lended to them is somehow inadequate. Gratitude is a very scarce currency nowadays, and you can just plumb into your own depths and examine how music, Freudian slip, but food shifts through the body, just to appreciate the incredible intricacy, not just of the large intestines, but even the acts of defecation itself. We have 2 sphincters right down there. We have various ways of doing it, and if anyone has taken one of these number 2s for a roll outside, you will appreciate how close to nature you feel when you happen to have to dig a little hole and give the earth back what it's due. It's curious that we have also, I mean, maybe uncharitable of me to say this, but there are people who are very curious about their own poo. RateMyPoo.com is not without followers. There's also something to do with something a little bit less direct, but still rather grateful and beautiful, which is the YouTube channel with almost 22,000 subscribers. This channel is called Commodes, and they just take films of toilets. They go into toilets. They even film outside the toilet. Could be at someone's house. Could be in a restaurant. Take the example of a video from 29th of December 2019. Bathroom tour. Elger toilet and urinal at Stoplight Diner. That's quite a nice title anyway in its own self. Its own kind of miniature toilet haiku. We've got commenters of this toilet. The description of which is written by Commodes. The toilet has a great flush. Not a fan of the washdown urinal, though. The 39 comments, some of the best of which have comments from Games and Toilets Productions. I love the strong flush on this toilet, and I found a few of these previously. Capturing toilets 2 months ago, felt the need to share. The toilet is an excellent find, and still seeming to be in great condition. The Random Video Guys, 2 months ago, love the toilet. Good flush. It goes on and on. TFL Plumbing, I like the colour on these. Toilet Explorer 2003, 6 days ago. Wow, rare. The Random Video Guys, 1, awesome. First comment. Vintage Cola, good find. And then, blank, because I can't speak Korean, said blank, because I still can't speak Korean, 1 week ago. Kingston Addict, very nice. Jose Juarez, 820, 1 week ago. Cool toilets. We have an obsession, it seems, with the certain squatting prowess we have in visiting the water closet. It's no coincidence that an art piece that has really pervaded these lectures, The Fountain by Marcel Duchamp, has such a hold on our imagination, selling for $1.7 million in the Sotheby's 1997 auction. They are rather grand edifices, mini edifices, petal-shaped, diamond-shaped, possibly like Courbet's The Origin of the Universe, the sort of vaginal sense of womb and security we sense when we go and find our own place to go. And unlike going for a number 1, number 2 is much more secure. You are held within 4 walls. There are nowadays not many places in the world where public shitting is practiced. We have the Nihao toilets in China where this is an exception. But generally speaking, we don't have these communal spaces of shitting. It's become very much an isolated practice. This isn't a natural progress at all, or process, in my opinion. This is, of course, culturally constructed. But there is something about having being surrounded by 4 walls that's very deeply comforting for humans. The therapeutic and mystical practice that I am involved with is called the inner space technique, and to actually get down to and really get to work with someone else and your own self, you have to be inside. It doesn't matter how nice it is to meditate outside. When you are horizontal on the ground, you need to be surrounded by 4 walls and a ceiling. So why the human feels the ability to release and unwind those tangled samskara, those emotional scars within 4 walls, I'm not sure. but it's an interesting aspect of therapy, in my opinion. So I'm going to turn to, before we have a sharing of our own enthusiasms with our tea set here. We'll have a little break in, 5-10 minutes. Before we have a little break, I'm just going to bring us back to a comparison between English dryness, constipation, and Portuguese hysterical wetness, or diarrhea, so to speak. I like to sort of divide the two countries in this dichotomy, very much in the way that our man, the Elvis of continental philosophy, the Elvis of philosophy at the moment, the Slovenian thinker Slavoj Žižek, very quickly, Žižek very, very wittily divided Germany, France and England into the triad of shitting. This is all on YouTube, really easy to find and very wittily expressed, almost too wittily expressed. You sometimes wonder with Žižek if his ideas are rather like a sort of philosophical version of a peacock, sort of distrusts his very attraction as a speaker. He said Germany is its own deeply analytical and literal-minded people, by the very fact that if you've ever taken a shit in Germany, you'll know why, because you'll have the platform version of the toilet where your shit will stay, for you to then analyse, look for blood as the mechanistic manner of thinking is. And this, with a straight face, people will tell you, yes, you are looking for blood. That's what you don't want. You don't want that. Do you want blood in your stool? France has a deeper hole, and you shit, and it goes straight down. And the French, being much more red-cheeked, much more hot-blooded, much more inclined to their revolutions, will eject what they find unpleasant and get it done the first. What this big myth fails to address is that England had and chopped off its own head much earlier than the French did, 120 or so years before the French. But we'll leave that aside. It's a nice idea about those French who are very ready to not look at their poo and to strike all day long. So then you move on into a kind of a compromise made by the British, and I think the British always stand in this middle point between two varying cultures. You've got German directness and American permeability, German serious-mindedness, and then you've got American openness and demonstrative expression, and then you've got British pragmatism. British, it all seems to be in the middle, and that's why I think England is such a fascinating country for sort of sharing the Germanic, the Anglo-Saxon, the American, and a little bit of the French as well. In England, it doesn't really know whether it's going to float or escape or jump back in your face. We don't really know. We can sort of semi-examine. I think that the English are extremely prone to their own neuroses. We love to joke about ourselves in England, but not too much. We love to take our issues and talk about them as a joke. There, could we get lights?
Yeah,
thanks.
Working on it.
Cool.
Try to censor you. No, way.
I understand. He thinks it's very rude.
It's quite a shit that the light went down. But
Is this so you go around and steal people's wallets?
I was MI6. Didn't like that.
no, we are not pragmatic as the British. No, you didn't. No, you didn't.
Ow! Well,
I have a question.
Shoot.
Thank you for asking. I think it's quite important for the contemporary way of existing right now. If you could share the napkins and toilet paper that is being amassed by people all around the world, from Australia to England to Portugal to North America. I think it would be important to have a contemporary Bataille way of amassing paper for the endpoint.
You're saying we
So
should...
people are writing their memoirs while they shit what's happening. I'll leave you with that.
I'm not 100% clear on a lot of things that leaves the mouth and say. What, are you suggesting we collect the used toilet paper across the world? No, I honestly don't understand the suggestion.
It's you were being too Eurocentric because if it floats, if you see it, if you stop seeing it, you always wipe it with a little bit of paper. And in other cultures, you use water. And I would like to, I don't know, should we amass water or toilet paper?
Water all the way, in my opinion. The Indians have got this one right. There, just for the recording, because it doesn't always capture it properly, there made a very proper and necessary suggestion. Pascal, you bigot from Britain, you oily, slimy English. This is really what he said. Why are you just analysing Europe, analysing Europe? What do they do with their hands or their paper in other parts of the world? Absolutely right. I only briefly mentioned Chinese toilets, but we haven't come to Indian practices of using water. The bidet has always struck me as a brilliant invention. But I won't go into it too much because I don't want to make you all throw up. But yeah, thank you, Zay, and very much noted for the next time you make the moronic decision and invite me to do a 4-lecture series. Brilliant, what a luxury. It's been great. Kind of like the idea of taking this on the road and mindlessly like splurging out all of this nonsense without having to do any research. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I found researching for these lectures like trying not to eat too much cake, and you just have to let your body digest it. If anything, it's just been a sense, a manner of digesting at home and then shitting in public what I already had in my body. It never was a case of learning for these lectures. It's always not a case of being original, just a case of presenting differently and analysing differently and pooing differently, spewing out in an unusual fashion for the joy of the multitudes of Lisbon. There's 2 people up there. Hello. So before we do, I promised you a break. I would just like to quickly move on from the tickling idea of Zizek's triad of toilets across Europe, long live Mother Europe, and just focus a little bit on, instead of Europe, more Europe, Western Europe, Portugal and England. 2 countries with a long relation, the longest in the world. The Treaty of Windsor from 1386, I believe, is the oldest relationship between 2 countries. We share many things in common, but what we do not share is an appreciation for dryness, constipation, for wetness, and for diarrhea. So let's start with, what do you want to hear first? Me insult Portugal, or me insult England? Anyone? You decide. I'll pour myself some more wine. England first. I think it's ruder to like the insult lands last. That's the one you'll remember, so you'll be more offended by the Portuguese one. Oh, do Portugal? So I want to like get my citizenship and be nice to this country. You can decode culture by looking at the avant-garde. Portugal's sonic, so-called leading, the lead of the army, the march ahead, the vanguard, is spewing ambient greyness across the airwaves. Go to a concert and you will never be able to see performative, experimental, spontaneous free jazz or noise music or experimental whatever. It will always be extremely long, very serious, very much connected with the with academia, with the universities, and very much taking itself seriously as my Portuguese brothers and sisters, if they can take it upon themselves to deal with my insults, might be inclined to do. Saudade has been understood as a poetic depression. Saudade, very quickly, is Portuguese for, well, we can't define it. It's very difficult for any other language to define with one word. You could say melancholy. It's not really quite melancholy. Saudade is, I believe, an actual indulgence, an attraction to depression. possibly even a celebration of the sadder things in life, a longing for lost things, and in many ways an elevation of missing and loss, which is very good in a psychiatric sense. Saudade is often associated with something very big and very wet, which is the Atlantic Ocean. The loss of the men in the colonies led to believe 30% of those ships never returned in the 1500s. So the women, particularly women of Lisbon's old town Alfama, had a lot to be sad about, and a lot of loss, the loss of the sons, the loss of the husbands, the loss of the brothers. So Saudade in many ways encompasses, you could say, if we're speaking maybe symbolically, not literally, but Saudade has possibly an attitude which we associate, and I'm not saying literally, but we associate with women. With the idea of hysteria, with letting it all out, not like the dry, brittle, constipated Brits, just like me. Dry England. Again, let's analyse England from the vanguard, from the avant-garde expressions of music, just in this strict sense. If you go to a gig in England, you'll see a skinhead punk with a nose ring throwing a chain around and yelling some toilet poetry that he invented. It's big, it's strong, it's theatrical, it's lacking potentially an introspective element, but it's out there, it's performative. English, and I come from a strong perspective of noise music, or noise as a musical practice, and many English noise bands currently moving and shaking, and one's already passed, seem to have this brittleness, this dryness, which really makes it British. Something about the embracing of silence. It's nothing like the heroes of noise, the Japanese, which is sort of a permanent, brutal exploitation of the ears to high decibels, very much an embrace of digital harshness. English or British noise has an attachment to acoustic noise, to using the space as an environment, as a way of roaming around and letting your neuroses control the body. This has worrying connections with the sort of fetishizing of mental illness. There's a lot of mouth noise made in England, a lot of improvisation using mouth, which you really never get to see on the Iberian Peninsula or in Portugal. And there seems to be a connection, of course, with, if Portugal has saudade, with hysterical releasing of your demons, then you've got British neuroses, sitting on your problems, sitting on your hands, stiff, dry, brittle, upper lip, and putting all your problems in a cupboard and locking that goddamn cupboard as quick as possible. What results in this is potentially the bizarre rituals of English politeness, the legendary sorry you will hear when you bump into someone in England. How neurotic can you be? But also, to borrow a phrase from Roland Barthes, Britain is its own empire of signs. Britain is in many ways the most anally retentive part of Europe. Mother Europe. Britain's empire of signs is striking as soon as you land in any airport, or if you fly British Airways. Apologies for this kind of very privileged analysis, but I once had the luxury of flying British Airways and won't do it again because they're so fussy. The stewards, stewardesses will come over and make sure everything's all right and apologise if they even suggest brushing your seat with their shoulders. You have no moment's peace from everything having to be fine and perfect. I've always felt the British were kind of like the Japan of Europe. We're always the ones with making sure appearances were perfect, that you did your utmost to keep a brave face and make sure that it wasn't in fact wrong to say fine to the answer to the question, how are you? That the British have this own incredibly layered series of rituals, and to make a comparison with Japan, a kind of linguistic bowing, the level of which no one is quite sure anymore in England what is rude and what is polite. But signs are a huge part of English life. You are perhaps afraid of being sued in England, afraid of being condemned, condemned to an invisible trial permanently. So English, both visually and I guess neurotically, has signs placed everywhere. No littering, no ball games played here, and so on and so forth. So at this point, and I promised you a little bit of tea, and I realise in such times as this, possibly sharing tea is not such a good idea. But if you're willing to risk it, I have washed my hands, and there is some wonderful Taiwanese tea that I got when I was out there in the company of these beautiful rocks, which have been themselves shot from the earth. These are volcanic rocks, the two on the left from the Azores, and the one on the right is just something I got from a hippie shop. But in any way, they're kind of a process of analysing that I found in Portugal and beyond. So let's have a 5-10 minutes break. Boys and girls, we're moving on. I just realised we just launched headfirst into the second part of the lecture, which will not last, hopefully, quite as long as the last one. I know it's cold and we all have loving husbands and wives and children to come home to, and beautiful roasting fires. But there's quite a bit to get through. Curiously, the shit. How did, by putting an article in front of shit, making this word from pejorative into kind of ordinary nothingness, neutral term, or even a positive term. A question from the website Reddit: why is the phrase "the shit" positive? As in, this band is the shit. This band is the shit. This band is shit is negative, but this band is the shit is positive. Why does adding the before shit turn a negative into a positive? Reply from Fnord_happy 4 years ago. I remember a hilarious conversation on Reddit related to this. Person A: I don't know the difference between the shit and shit. Person B: the shit means the best, whereas shit means it sucks. Person A: oh, I get it now. Thanks, that is the shittiest advice ever. Haha, language, you fickle mistress. So, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, again I'm quoting from another Redditor, John Pennington, the first documented use of the shit to refer to something excellent, as opposed to the more common use of shit to refer to something as of poor quality, was in a 1987 unpublished typescript manuscript of the campus slang at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. The first documented appearance of the shit with positive connotations in a published source, according to the Oxford English Dictionary. I've analysed the two words there into one. Yes, was in a 1991 issue of Source magazine, a hip-hop magazine. According to the OED entry, this particular usage, thank you very much, this particular usage of the shit first started out as more common among African Americans, probably starting out in the South. Hip-hop also probably played a role in popularising the uses of the shit in the 1990s. What a long-winded way to talk about a beautiful term, amelioration, to make better. A very quite rare linguistic phenomenon where a bad term turns good or turns neutral. If you pause one moment with me, I can find the relevant quote on this. So this is a quote from, this is something I've taken another long quote from, this time from the slate.com, and it talks about how usually words don't quite take this travel, this sort of a journey, so to speak. But there are some exceptions, and to quote the Slate article, back in Shakespeare's day, when one's lineage mattered a lot more, so when your family played a much bigger role in public life, the word bastard was so offensive it was often written B-D. And this reminds me that you call someone a son of a bitch in England or America, it's bad, it's not good, don't suggest you go and do it, but you don't want to do it here. It's pretty offensive in this country, and I think even more so in the much more familial or family-obsessed country of Italy. But it's really curious what becomes most offensive in languages. Curious, and also something utterly unresearched by these lectures. I'm going to write this down here. Most offensive. There we go. I've learned to write down my thoughts during the lectures. Why, for example, is cunt so offensive in England? And where is the source of this softness, this rawness? It must be to do with the country's approach to sex. Known as the worst in bed in Europe, the Brits, over many years with their bad teeth, find the word for female genitalia the most offensive. That's very curious. As a living, spontaneous thought experiment, in Portuguese, what's the most? I mean, corner. What's the most offensive word? Would you say in Islam? Filho de puta is pretty strong.
In Portugal occurs naturally.
That's very interesting. This idea of movement from the below, puta que pariu.
Estou-me a cagar para ti.
Puta que pariu is very similar. The woman that gave birth. The woman that gave birth. God damn it. The woman that gave birth. But it's very much an idea of movement from below.
Estou-me a cagar para ti. I'm shitting to you.
On you.
On you. Sim.
Thank you so much for throwing onto this compost heap of linguistic expression. Huh?
Everybody says it all the time.
Estou-me a cagar para ti.
Yeah,
Por si ou para ti.
Para ti.
But
For you.
Para isto.
But you can shit on a lot of things, yeah. Podes cagar
yeah.
para... Estou-me a cagar para esta situação.
It's Old Norse. Isn't it interesting as well? In my experience teaching English here and across Europe, is that I always teach swearing because you find the heart of a language through its swearing, and I think the English heart is German and is Norse and is Anglo-Saxon. Cunt, fuck, shit. I mean, you'll be hard pressed to find many Latin or French-based swear words in English. Hayden, you mentioned that swearing, the sewerage of English would be with regards to ethnic minorities.
I would say today they're more dangerous. In the past, it was more, words beginning with P and N, for example, or F, were more acceptably socially acceptable in, say, before, I guess, 1980, 90-ish, I guess, ish.
Yeah.
But it changes through time, doesn't it? But I mean, now those are the most dangerous words to use. In the past, they were tossed around casually, just in polite conversation as though nothing.
Yeah.
It still is in the countryside. Where I come from, it is used in a casual way.
But let me be clear, England is the first in industry and intelligence and stupidity. Let's get that right. We pioneer in everything, including moronic, idiotic behaviour.
I don't agree. It's only steam. Steam, okay, 100 years.
Who's okay?
The Industrial Revolution.
Steam
Industrial Revolution,
and
the first
before
ethnic
and
minorities
after,
to live
nothing.
in Europe.
No.
You look at how old the Chinese
Steam.
population is in Manchester. It's hundreds of years old. We're the first country in the best and the worst. We're the first to succeed and we're the first to fail. We're the first ones with the railway lines. We're the first one with the shittest railway lines. That's why France is silent, beautiful, forward, futuristic. SNCF is so good because you do not want to invent in this life. You want to innovate. It's the whole point of this lecture. You don't want to come up with anything new. You want to present old ideas really, really well. This is the French railway of new
Everyone
philosophy.
takes the British schematic and just creates and improves it.
We came up with the best anarchist philosophy, the best approaches to model villages, to communitarian life, to anarchist Christianity, in my opinion. And we're the first one, therefore, let me finish. We're the first ones to fail and fuck up. We are on the crest of the wave. We are the surfer on the top of the wave in stupidity now. We are ahead of everyone else. Everyone wants to be us. Austria wants to be us. We're the ones who've done Brexit. That, in a way, is pioneering.
This conversation is offline, and I can say it's a shitty conversation because we are not in the countryside. It's a shitty conversation. I rest my case.
You rest your case, and apparently you're resting your bowels as well. Let's move on. It's been great. This is the most shared part of the 4 lectures, so I really treasure this. And I think if the lectures are going to go anywhere, of course we've got the reading circle every Saturday at 5 p.m. Come along. In our Alchemy and Bataille reading circle, come along. We're going to meet in a park probably. We haven't arranged it.
3 meters.
Yeah, no, not free beers. Fuck off. YouTube generation expecting everything free. Fuck you. Free mansions. Free mantras. Hey, by the way, Hayden keeps coming up with stuff which is triggering great parts of new processes in the lecture. Transcendental meditation. We don't have enough time to even go into this, but a form of mysticism which is really fascinating and really deserves a lot of our attention, precisely because I think it's succeeded first and it's failed the first. It was the Maharishi, I don't know the name, but the leader of transcendental meditation, as followed by heroes like Jerry Seinfeld and David Lynch. David Lynch, come on, gotta listen to Lynch. Who follows a form of meditation, exactly, but that was explicitly trying to exploit people, explicitly exploiting people with money, trying to get as much money into its coffers.
What about Spring that he said he could fuck for 8 hours followed after?
Is that tantric?
Tantric state.
Oh, that's tantric. That's something.
Ah,
Well,
sorry, mantra.
hey, well, I mean, last lecture we suggested having an orgy here. An orgy being a sense of organising, working together, orgasm, work, having that same root. Sorry, orgasm is.
8 hours with Sting.
No, that's totally easy and possible. That's more Vedic stuff, and again, it's going to happen in a park. Our reading circle. Anything can happen, Gemma. Just be safe. What I wanted to say about transcendental meditation is hero of heroes, David Lynch, Mark Frost, the kings of Twin Peaks. David Lynch is a huge proponent of transcendental meditation, which contains its own insurmountable nigredo, the black substance of the first process of alchemy. Whether I can tolerate such a steaming pile of dung in one wonderful approach to mysticism, transcendental meditation, I'm not sure. But that's definitely I've got some transcendental meditation texts on me. They are horrible and terrible and definitely not worth reading. But Lynch's expression of it is fantastic. And it's great you brought me to this, because Mark Frost, the co-creator of Twin Peaks, called the series a cultural compost heap, which leads into really the inclination to do a postmodern analysis of borrowing and showing and the peacock philosophy I mentioned earlier. But what more can we do now? We've exhausted all our genre. We're struggling. We're stuck nowadays, both in musical terms and elsewhere, to think of any new substantive genre. It leads us to the heroic stuckists of Britpop or 90s British art, who said, you're not a painter, you're not an artist unless you can paint, you're not an artist unless you can paint. Back to basics, back to modernism, back to the original questions that we've always been asking, which is the questions of the modernists. To depart quite away from that, I want to go and quickly draw on one or two things before we say goodbye. One of them is, with this glorious ringing in our ears, the eternal city diarrhea that is someone's car alarm in the distance. I want to just read the prayer again from the Talmud. This prayer is the prayer which is said by Orthodox and Hasidic Jews, some Orthodox, some Hasidic Jews, when they go to the toilet. And it's all about a celebration of something that I can form as a heroic ideal of the reading circle, if this is going to really happen, which is the ideal of a perfect sphincter. Sphincter as being this beautiful image of something that releases when it needs to and contains when it should. And I'm going to read both translations of this from the Hebrew. Translation 1. So this is the let me just repeat, a prayer said by many Orthodox and Hasidic Jews when you go to the toilet. Translation 1. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, King of the universe, who formed man with wisdom and created him with many openings and many hollow spaces. It is obvious and known before your seats of honour that if even one of them would be opened, or if even one of them would be sealed, it would be impossible to survive and to stand before you, even for 1 hour. Blessed are you, Adonai, who heals all flesh and acts wondrously. That's a lovely last line. Blessed are you, Adonai, who heals all flesh and acts wondrously. Second translation. It's nice to pull it out a little bit and analyse it in its own way. I have not laboured this point enough. Translation 2. Blessed is God who has formed the human body in wisdom and created many orifices and cavities. Isn't it wonderful to think of your body as having its own knowledge, having its own wisdom, being formed in wisdom? The whole point of subrealism is to let the body speak, to get away from the head, to get away from visual culture. To continue, it is obvious and known before you that if one of them were to be opened or closed incorrectly, it would be impossible to survive and stand before you at all. We can't be servers of God without getting our business done. Isn't that a wonderful idea? You are in the worst moment of your emotional struggling, and you forget everything because you need to blow your nose. The body acts first and you follow simply. So the body has to be correct for you to stand up to transcendence. Joseph Pilates with a not so memorable line. Yeah, go Pilates. Some Pilates fans in the house. The first component of human happiness is physical correctness. The first component of human happiness is bodily healthiness, which I am paraphrasing and misquoting, but that's the idea. You've got to get your body done first. So this is going to be difficult, of course, in a culture that has seats and toilets, right? Because the idea of the attribution to so many bowel diseases right now, as I said, 50 million Americans suffer from constipation and some kind of bowel disruption. What is it? Constipation. Can anyone guess what it is? Very common bowel problem. Constipation. It'll come. I'll edit it in later so it looks like I knew what I was talking about. But it's not diarrhea.
Irritable bowel syndrome.
It could, no, it's not. But IBS is great. IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, is the term doctors give you when they don't know what the problem is.
I love the use of irritable.
Irritable.
It's not happy.
Scratching away.
It's annoying. Consider it perfect also with this
Imperfection.
imperfection.
That's where I'm going. You've run ahead of it. God damn you. But no, I'll go to the second point, which is our bodies were not supposed to sit on chairs. It's very fashionable to say that chairs are giving cancer to 3 billion people in Portugal. I'm joking, but it's fashionable to say these things, but it's rather convincing as you move along in life and you think, shit, this is not right. We shouldn't be doing this to ourselves. And as a Pilates instructor,
So you have a ball in your house to sit on the computer. Of course.
well, Shay didn't see this.
You're
Sorry.
like,
I wanted to do it.
do it right now.
No, I can't. Anyway, I've invented it. It's not. I'll tell you afterwards.
Good. Lucky you.
Because he laid down and he put his.
Already 9. These lectures have been going on forever. You're still here. You haven't got better things to do. I'm a Pilates instructor. Pilates is great because it's supposed to not be spiritual, right? It's supposed to be very scientific, really rational, very German. Simply stepping into the body has to be such a profound experience that, for want of a better word, we just call it spiritual. Now, Joseph Pilates...
It's called having a good sheet or a bad sheet.
Mindfulness, eating an orange, that's actually eating an orange, and going for a shit could be thought of as peeling through these everyday experiences and finding the base materialism, as Bataille said, the ordinariness, the Protestant elevation of the ordinary, and seeing it as a kind of holy and sacred thing. No, my point isn't this. You do not need metaphysics to find spirituality, in my opinion. You simply need to follow the instructions of Joseph Pilates or Frederick Alexander, quite a similar technique, shedding away your habits that you've been told to do, and you arrive at somewhere which is so profoundly against the grain of your culture that, yes, we don't have many good words for this, but we could call it spiritual, metaphysical, or mystical, or religious. The whole point of these lectures was movement and was of a towards. It was never of a stasis. It was never to arrive coming down the mountain with the 10 Commandments. It was a way of letting an idea breathe and letting it, as we said last lecture, let this place be an open cavity. Let this be the kidneys of Lisbon, where ideas not necessarily stay, but they move. So it's interesting that Zare uses a word that was used by physicians and by medical practitioners. Evacuate. What a great word for talking about shitting. I mean, there's so much movement within that very word. Shitting has often been considered as a contact between the internal and the external, and it's a wonder to people who receive poo, urine for sexual purposes, semen, that it's warm. You get a trace of the body. But also it's also a reminder for me of the absurdity of being given a body, that it has a kind of a piece of information to tell you that isn't just visual, that it's via touch. And whether we're privileging one idea of sense, or one form of sense over the other, that's okay. We just need to get out of the visual. But touch is where we're heading, I believe, just to exfoliate spiritually. And so the warmth of shit, the steam it produces, the sight of steam gives us the sense of warmth, which itself is a physical rubbing. So I think that might be a nice place to... Is it? So this is the thing, because we're moving so much. I
thought you just arc back to the beginning.
Can you do the lecture for me right now? I'm exhausted. I've way too much.
It's a nice way to finish, because I thought you were summing it up, like a callback to the beginning.
What was the beginning?
I can't remember.
What year is this? The last
Who are
line
you?
in Twin Peaks season 3.
I was thinking that you were talking about like a kind of salvation through the gutter, you know.
And I think, Moshe, this has been the divine lie. I think this is the point about spirituality in the modern age, for me, which is it's nothing I've been saying. I've exaggerated certain things just to make sure we exfoliate and we shed our skin and we metamorphise. I can't tell you, well, perhaps we should do this and blah blah blah, because the whole point of the French philosophers, those writers that I love and hate in equal measure, Roland Barthes, Deleuze and Guattari, Derrida, was that they were so performative, theatrical, over the top, exaggerated, but they wanted to make a point. They wanted to leave an impression, and I think their texts perform much more than they explain or leave their words. And
Gymnastic of the thought, maybe.
they're a gymnastic of the thought. They're fantastic. They're a way of making your head grow muscle fibre by exerting. So the divine lie is, no, we're not going into the gutters to find transcendence. Not at all. In a strict sense, we're not gonna dive down into our guts and sewers. That is not what we're looking for. We're actually looking for something else that I can't express. I can't put words on.
So how do you find mysticism?
You have to.
What are you trying to do when you're like involved, thinking in this way?
The reason I say it's the divine lie, and maybe I'm being a little bit too literal, but I think the inheritance of bad habit, and that sounds so mild, but this is centuries of forgetting who we were as human beings after the Industrial Revolution, after the Enlightenment, after saying science can answer all of our problems. We're left with a coldness to the world and a realization that there is something else, and a lack of knowledge of how to get there. This is why people do the weirdest stuff to get there. Like you said, groups of teenagers from all over Europe, privileged Europe, going on ayahuasca voyages to wherever, Mexico. But I have no problem with that, because it doesn't matter how arbitrary or contrived or artificial, at least they're doing something to shed the skin and to move on and to metamorphise. As long as it means movement, then you can say, however, this is the mistake of the postmodernists, who say movement is transcendence. That's not what I'm saying. Simply by exfoliating, spiritually speaking, or moving on, that is not enough. The idea in lecture 3 was commitment to truth. And that's something that the modernists had and the postmodernists didn't. So I really believe it's the surrealists, and now yawn, the subrealists, is where we need to return. I feel not uncertain whether I've given you a satisfactory response, Moshe.
Sort of, you mentioned truth, and this complicates it like a whole deal.
It was a shitty response.
Thank you, Zay.
And alchemic at the same time, because movement is alchemy, changing from one state to the other, and we're not in the US, so they only have 52 states. We as humans, we have much more.
Speak your mind, though. I feel like...
Don't hold back.
Yeah.
You're talking to me?
Yeah. Oh, anyone, but yeah. I feel like I don't want to trap you.
No. So you were talking about alchemy, which is like you said before about the gold. You mentioned gold as like the aim of this process, and the gold is a metaphor for something that is transcendent, great, shiny, spiritual, and so in what sense? What is the sense of spirituality? Being transformed where? Does it have like a positive value or a negative value or anything like that?
Isabel, so she was here the other lectures, disappointing, doesn't want to get infected, clearly. She said subreal, this artificial and maybe not very useful term, could mean, and this is really hard for me to say, the part of your mental approach to the world or your emotional idea of the world that you cannot escape, you cannot shake off. It's so deep within you that it's beyond social deconstruction, it's beyond thinking. And I was skeptical. Thought, I hope that makes sense. So what I want to say is, I don't want to give you a hesitant, doubtful, kind of fashionable response, which is spirituality is whatever you make it. That's New Ageism, and we're not doing that. Okay. But I really think we're going into the realm of esotericism, which for me, and this is the real risk of esotericism, which is, he's got to be initiated. He can't know if he asks questions with his head. He must experience with his body, which is an excuse for not bothering to evangelize. So we need to reclaim evangelism for esotericism. On the other hand, we need to still give first place to experience. Like, you've got to do it for yourself. The effort that you will be required to do it will be the sort of currency with which you will enjoy a reward of mystical experience. That's my very long answer. But on the other hand, and to make a really nice, and I will in a second, really nice 21st century, it's whatever you want it to be. Genuinely, it is, because I love things that make me feel like I'm rising. And you might like one day, but it'll take a long time. So I'll go and watch a 3.5 hour historical drama, which is cheesy and badly made, but it will make me sing, or I'll watch a musical, or I'll listen to hardcore noise music. It really is something that I think belongs to the subreal, because I don't think we choose our tastes as much as our ears can be open to influences. So final thing before I go to Felipe is, I really don't want to give any clear indication of what the path is. If they come, and if I make a sort of Pascal's process. It will come through the reading circle, and you should come. It's Saturday, 5 p.m.
We will buy a book.
Whoa. We are ending the lecture series. I can't believe it's spiraled up this way. We've got yelling from above and rumbles from below. Can you feel the tremors of bodily knowledge?